Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me now? Yeah. I know, the conversation is awesome. But I would encourage you to take a seat for the second part of the second half of our event. And I want to start by introducing Professor Paulo Afonso. Paulo Afonso is a professor of astronomy at the American River College in Sacramento. His first degree is in physics by the University of Lisbon, and his MA and PhD studies focus on high energy astrophysics. High energy is a good descriptor of you, Paulo. High energy astrophysics, gamma ray bursts, and quasars as the farthest away and most energetic known objects in the universe. Paulo has a serious interest in cartography and the history of the discoveries ever. This brings him to travel the world from Antarctica to the Amazon, Asia, and Middle East. We just came from the Southern Hemisphere, tracing the steps of ancient Portuguese navigators. So we are very glad you are here. Thank you for organizing this event. We're going to give you the microphone so that everyone can hear you. Okay.
You can hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so thank you so much for being here. I talk fast because the universe is expanding and we don't have much time. Thank you so much for hosting me here. The amazing team of people with whom I had the pleasure of organizing this conference. I'm extremely happy, and the first word I have to say is wow. Wow, because we have amazing teachers here, amazing speakers. And as Isaac Newton, he used to say, the reason I saw so far was because I climbed to the giants, to the shoulders of some giants. And we have some giants here. So thank you, Professor Paulo Afonso. Thank you, Marco Cabrillo. Thank you, and so among these giants with whom you learn, I would like to thank Professor Dr. Randy Kramer, without whom part of my work would not be possible. So thank you, Dr. Randy Kramer. We invited her to be here as well. It was not possible, unfortunately. And I also would like to thank Eric Kalse, although he died about a year ago. He's also a giant in terms of knowledge about Cabrillo. So without them, indeed, I wouldn't be able to produce part of my work. I'm going to show several errors, several mistakes from Wendy Kramer and Eric Kalse. But it's not a personal thing, obviously. It's instead, you probably heard about Gaston Bachelard and La Philosophie du Non, the philosophy of no. The best way to honor your masters, the best way to honor those giants is to deny them, to show the errors that they did. So when I'm showing the errors of Kramer and the errors of Kelsey, I'm honoring them. Okay, so that's my perspective here. And I hope you find errors in my work, because that's the best way to honor me as well, because errors bring progress. We need progress. There's so much we still don't know here. So with this principle of the philosophy of no, of honoring your masters, to showing that the mistakes they did, so that's my approach here, extremely objective and scientific. Right? Okay, so let me start by the letter from Pablo de Torres. I apologize, the transfer of the PowerPoint between computers apparently cut a little bit of my slides, but in 1550s, Pablo de Torres, the Bishop of Panama, wrote, this is the original document with its primary sources, right? Half of the pilots and sailors in the Eastern Pacific, the Mar del Sur, are Portuguese. So that's a tremendous statement, right? So who are these half sailors? Not just Cabrillo, there are more, right? And oops. And so no surprise here that half of them were Portuguese, because Spain had a tremendous lack of pilots. There are too many conquerors fighting among each other. But as an example, Cortés dramatically exemplifies this lack of pilots when he wrote in 1538 a letter for the Council of Indies saying, send me pilots. I searched for pilots in Panama, in Mexico, in Guatemala, in Nicaragua. I cannot find them. So he had 9 ships ashore waiting to continue his explorations of Baja California. And this was not a temporary problem either. Much later, so 86 years later, after Spain had a pilot major and a school to form pilots, they still didn't have enough pilots. And as an example, when the Viceroy of New Spain, Luis de Velasco, hires Sebastião Rodrigues Surumano, he wrote the following. Surumano is a nice guy, he knows what to do despite being Portuguese. But there are no Castilians with such skills to make the demarcation and explore the coast of California. So this is an intrinsic problem from Spain, not having enough skilled people, and no surprise, the letter of the Bishop of Panama, right? And so this reflects as well in the fleet of Cabrillo and the exploration of Alta California. And in fact, at the moment, all the known pilots and captains in Cabrillo's fleet, all of them are foreigners, not a single one is Spanish. Of course, the crew, the regular sailor, yes. But Cabrillo was Portuguese, Bartolomé Ferreira was Genoese, not Spanish, another thing to correct here, honoring the masters. Antonio Correia from Viana do Castelo, also Portuguese. Lourenço Fernandes Barreto was from Corsica. At the time, Corsica belonged to the Republic of Genoa, right? And Geronimo Sanremo, also a friend of Bartolomé Ferreira, likely from the name, he was probably from Sanremo being also a protectorate of Genoa at the time, right? And I think I may find another one, let me come to that. Again, documentation is very scarce here, difficult to find, but if you look at the testimony of Francisco de Vargas was in the crew of Cabrillo's fleet, and he was married with one of the daughters or native daughters of Cabrillo. And so he said, among the pilots that went in the expedition of Cabrillo, there was a Matia and Bartolomé Ferreira. Everyone knows Bartolomé Ferreira, but who the heck is this Matia? Right? So I've been scratching my head for a long time, and I think I may find maybe a clue, I'm not sure. But Nicaragua is, I'm going to talk a lot about Nicaragua, right? Nicaragua was the rotating door for expeditions, for supplies, for wood, for naval construction, for pilots. To understand Cabrillo and the finding of California, you need Nicaragua. Until now, everyone ignored Nicaragua tremendously. So there's an amazing collection of 17 volumes, 17 compilation volumes of all documents that you can find in the General Archive of the Indies. And there's one that says Bartolomé de Matea. He's a pilot of these ships. Okay, maybe it's not him, but that's the only Matea that I could find so far. So maybe this is there were not that many. So there's a likelihood that it could be this Bartolomé Matea, the Matia that mentioned there. So maybe we can add another one, question mark, I'm not sure. By the name Italic Peninsula, maybe he was a foreigner as well. But again, this reflects what the Bishop of Panama wrote in Cabrillo's expedition. So let's have a look. How do I know that Cabrillo was Portuguese and so on and so on? So let's have a look into that now, right? So I will start by this discussion and ambiguity of what natural of a place means. It does not mean native. That's a bad translation in English. And so we also have this document from the Arquivo General de Indias. This is the relation of Cabrillo's voyage, where it says, when Cabrillo died, the pilot major Bartolomé Ferrer replaced him, and he's natural Levantisco. So that means from the region of the rising sun, where the sun comes up. Is this the Mediterranean coast of Spain? Is this the Middle East? Is this Genoa? Too many Spanish. No, he's Spanish. He's from Valencia. He's from, where does it say he's Spanish? I don't see it. That's the only document that exists, right? And so if you look at the Real Academy of History in Spain, they even say he's Basque, right? Where the heck is Basque, right? Where is the document, right? Is he Basque? He's from Valencia, he's from the Spanish Mediterranean coast. There is no documentation at all. So this is not serious anymore, right? So I spoke with an expert on Basque explorers in the Pacific Ocean, William Douglas from the University of Madrid. No, Ferrer doesn't show in my book, I never heard from it. So I found the testament of Ferrer. You have to go to the primary sources, right? And he says, I'm a natural of the Riviera of Genoa from a little location, a village called Albissola Marinas over here, and that's Genoa around there. He says, my father was Pedro Ferrer, my mother, Barbara. I have a cousin called Enaldino in Nicaragua. So he's not Spanish, right? But he says he's natural. So, well, indeed, in some cases, being natural, if he says, this is my father, this is my mother, and there are no naturalization laws in Genoa that we know. In the first assessment, in the first approach, quite often being a natural indeed meant you were born there, but not always. And that's the crux of the problem, not always. In particular in Spain, where we have all these naturalization laws, right? So if the example of Bartolomé Ferrer convinces you that natural means you are born, I can give you a counterexample. Amerigo Vespucci, right? He got a naturalization letter in April 24, 1505 that says, from now on, it shall be considered a natural of these kingdoms of mine as if you were born there. Vespucci was not born in Spain, but he was natural of Spain. He was born in Florence. So I'm giving two examples where Bartolomé Ferrer says, I'm natural of Genoa, therefore I was born there, and it means acceptable, sounds good. And another one where natural doesn't mean you were born there. So to be extremely careful, you cannot jump into conclusions. about the meaning of being natural, right? And likely that's what happened with Cabrillo. We have some other data that says it's Portuguese. We have some other data that says it's natural. So you have to balance all the data versus jumping into conclusions, right? And so that's what Wendy Kramer found. She found several documents that says João Rodrigues Cabrillo, natural de Palma de Miserguillo. It doesn't say born, okay? For some people who insist that Cabrillo was born in Spain, that's all you have. All you have is saying is natural. It doesn't say nacido. Nacido is the Castilian word for being born. Very careful with that, right? Okay, and it's not just me saying this is all history. Tamar Herzog, the professor of the University of Harvard, she has several books published on this. Plenty more examples of being a natural doesn't mean to be born. So this is mandatory reading. If you want to make serious scholarship, you need to do your homework first, right? We tried to invite Professor Herzog to be here, but unfortunately she couldn't make it. Another example. João Rodrigues Surumano, well, this is in Portuguese because it's from a Portuguese researcher who published. He says Rodrigues Surumano was hired, as we saw a few moments ago, to explore the coast of California around 1594, 1595. His testament says the following: I was born in Sesimbra, which is south of Lisbon. He says, I'm born in Sesimbra, but I'm a natural of Lagos in the south of Portugal, where he got married, he spent some time there, and I'm a neighbor of Mexico City. So this fellow was born in Sesimbra, but he's a natural of Lagos. Hello, right? I rest my case, right? What else can you add here? So it's not the same with being a natural of place X doesn't mean you're a native, and often it doesn't mean you were born there. It can, as we saw the example of Ferrer, but again, no jumping into conclusions, right? So this is quite common, this ambiguity of what means being a natural or being born. Sorry, the characters are a bit small, but even common citizens like Barros de Carvalho, Francisco Barros de Carvalho, he was in trouble in Mexico, he's about to lose his land. So no, but I'm a natural of Galicia, but at some point that didn't, you're a natural, therefore what? But I'm a natural and born, right? Natural y nacido, right? In Galicia, so please don't kick me away, I'm not Portuguese, I'm not just natural, I'm also born, natural y nacido, right? And so that's why I have, as an example, Francisco Pizarro, right? He declared in his testament, I'm natural and born, natural y nacido in Trujillo of Spain. If natural means indeed being born, this is totally absurd. Then he would be saying, I'm born and born.
Right.
I'm born and born, what's the point, right? That's because natural doesn't mean you are born necessarily. This is so obvious, but what can you do? Another paradigmatic example is Santa Teresa d'Avila, the saint. She was born in Avila, but she spent significant amounts of time in Alba de Tormes, which is a village not far away from Avila. When she died, she was beatified, she was considered a saint, but you couldn't be born in both places. But both villages said she's natural of Alba de Tormes and she's natural of Avila, and that's okay. You can be natural of two places. You spend lots of time in one place, you spend lots of time in another place, that's okay. But you're only born in one, you cannot be born in both, right? And this is typical of 16th century Spain. This kind of cases was quite common. Okay, so another example of the ambiguity of natural versus so on. And again, it's not the first time this happens. Please learn history. Please do your homework. João Dias Solis was a pilot major of Spain. He was Portuguese, and repeatedly for 400 years, the Spanish insisted, no, he is natural from Lepe, he's natural from Lebrija, therefore he's born Spanish. Therefore nothing. There are multiple documents from the King of Portugal saying he killed his wife, he ran away from Spain to Spain. He left Afonso de Albuquerque alone in the Tagus River when they were going to India. He was the pilot. And so João Dias Solis is a Portuguese homicide, right? He was searched by the Portuguese justice, and there are letters from the King of Portugal saying so. There was an amazing Chilean historian, José Uribe Medina, who was the first to acknowledge this, right? So this coveting of the Portuguese nationality of several sailors, not just João Dias Solis, Cabrillo, Lope Martim Lagos versus Diamond, Isabel Barreto. It's a systematic, at least, misunderstanding, let's put it that way, of the meaning of natural, right? So I just wanted to bring things down. And so when I say we need other data, so we have, as Professor Mariano Quested so elegantly showed today, Herrera said, yeah, Cabrillo is Portuguese, very skilled in the sea, etc. Those who defend that Cabrillo is Spanish must say, no, Herrera is wrong. What about you are wrong? Right? Why Herrera? There's no base, no. Yeah, you can make mistakes, but that doesn't glue that argument, right? And so, unfortunately, there's a group of people led by the president of the House of Spain who's been trying to remove the statue of Cabrillo from the Cabrillo National Monument, try to remove the plates of the Portuguese Navy. I don't want to go into politics, I prefer to discuss science. I'm going to limit myself into this. So they say that the name Cabrillo does not exist in Portugal. Let's prove that all of this is wrong. So let's see that the name Cabrillo does exist in Portugal. So in fact, if you look at medieval songs in the 13th century, there's a suggestion that part of the song was inspired in the surname Cabrillo. I'm not totally sure if this is a Portuguese surname or Galician, but there's a chance that Cabrillo as a surname, at least by the 13th century, already did exist in Portugal. Okay, so that's point number one. Point number two, if you look at the 1758 parish memories, there was a major questionnaire done across Portugal to report on the most important things in your village, this and that. There you go. There's a report about the most important mountains in Serra do Gerês, north of Portugal, Lamas, Borrageiro, or Cabrillo, LH. That's Mount Cabrillo in Portugal. For those who say that it doesn't exist, there you go. Mount Cabrillo in the north of Portugal. And funny enough, not far away, just 10 kilometers away from La Pele de Cabrillo. So that's Mount Cabrillo. And La Pele de Cabrillo, where supposedly Cabrillo was born, is not too far. Out of all places in Portugal, the only Mount Cabrillo is just across the corner, right around the corner, the corners. So that's quite big. Again, Alexandre Colano, Portuguese historian, he travels across Portugal. He says, yeah, I'm climbing these mountains. To my left, there's the mountains of Cabrillo. So this is 1850s, okay? So at least 3 entries of Cabrillo. And then if you go to La Pele de Cabrillo, there's a family there, the Rodrigues family, who claims that Cabrillo offered them this crucifix. And say, yeah, kidding me, right? I have a crucifix from Vasco da Gama or from Magellan. Sounds like a fairy tale. They are quite honest people, quite low-key. I don't see any reason for them to lie. But they were kind enough to we cut a little bit of a piece of wood, and we did the analysis of carbon-14. If, again, learning with Wendy Kramer, if Cabrillo went to Spain in 1532, if indeed they gave them the crucifix around that time, then the carbon-14 results should validate that, and they do. They do validate 1530s, right? So I don't want to explain you all the details of carbon-14 rating, but you can measure how many decays occur, the carbon data aging, but you need to calibrate to nowadays data, and you need to calibrate against the dendritic growth, the rings in trees as well. And so we have 2 peaks of about equal probability. One of them is exactly 1530, 1532. Right. The other one is 1650, so it's also probable. Again, this is not the final solution, but one has to be honest. It could also be from 1650, but at least this one has an history behind it, right? So now it's possible that that family is correct indeed. At least carbon-14 says, yeah, it's very probable, right? So you cannot ignore this data either, right? Okay, so that's, so I think Cabrillo exists in Portugal as a name, right? Would you agree with that question there? So if the family existed there, can I find records of any Rodrigues family in the area? Yeah, indeed. This gentleman, Paulo Ben, he found these documents about 10 years ago. They are now in the Braga University of Minho District Archives. But they speak about the family of Rodrigues. So there's Duarte Rodrigues, there's Domingo Rodrigues here. It's a village with 60 persons, right? There are hundreds of Portuguese family names. It's interesting that Rodrigues exists there. Are they potentially, maybe, the family of Cabrillo? Maybe not, we don't know. But there were some Rodrigues around 1520, at least. This is documented in the same area, right? Okay, so if I go back again. So we just saw that Cabrillo does exist in Portugal. Wrong, right? Now, they also say that the name João Rodrigues Cabrillo is a complete fabrication. I quote, complete fabrication from the Portuguese community. You cannot find the name anywhere else, also wrong. Okay, so this is Georg Forster. Georg Forster's publication, 1790s. Georg Forster was the naturalist of Captain Cook's voyage around 1770s in the Pacific. And he writes Juan Rodrigues de Cabrillo with LH. He's not copying Herrera, obviously, right? And it's not, the Portuguese community in 1950s, 1960s, and 78 didn't know Georg Forster centuries earlier. Kidding, do they go back in time and fabricate things in 1770s? I find it difficult. Right, another couple of examples. João Rodrigues with a Z, de Cabrillo. This is a dictionary from a professor at the University of Zurich, which spells the name like that, 1893. Traubert Brommer, an amazing German explorer in North America, he wrote Rodrigues with an S, de Cabrillo, 1838. And even Immanuel Kant, the famous German philosopher, everyone knows him from philosophy, but in fact he made his money, he paid his bills and got his food. He was a professor of geography most of his life. And in the German book, Physics Geography from 1801, he also says Cabrillo, and says Cabrillo, a Portuguese who led the expedition, right? So all this was fabricated by the Portuguese San Diego community. Okay, so moving on. The oldest record we have in Portuguese records about the Portuguese Cabrillo, it's Rodrigo, not Rodrigues, but Rodrigo Cabrillo. I don't know exactly, it's difficult to nail down the data, but around 1799, 1804, Fray Dom Antonio de Visitação, who was a professor of history and geography in this monastery in Lisbon. So that's, as far as I know, that's the oldest document where Cabrillo shows up in Portuguese records, right? And again, this is not fabricated by the people in San Diego. Yeah. Furthermore, in 1754, Philippe Bois, the French royal cartographer, he made a copy of a map from 1604 that says Bahia de Cabrillo with LH. And the map, the copy says 1604, so this is older than Herrera, right? It's the oldest appearance of the name Cabrillo with LH. The same people that say that it's fabricated, this is an error. Herrera is wrong, Bois is wrong, everyone is wrong except them, right? It's okay. So after 1 year of digging, I managed to find the original map. So I thanked to the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, the French National Library. They were kind enough to locate the map, and they sent me low resolution photos because the map is in a bad state, as you can see. But you can see here Bahia de Cabrillo, the original map. So there is no wrongly copied by Bois. But in 1604, we have a map at about 40 degrees north that says Bahia de Cabrillo. Okay. So don't tell me once again that the name doesn't exist. And this is the only map that exists in the world, it's quite rare. Marco Cavuaro will tell us more about it. I don't want to go into much into details. But you have Cape Mendocino, and you have this mysterious Puerto de Perras. I think this is already a second-hand source. If you replace P by an F and the last S by an R, it reads Ferrer. Maybe the curly peak, maybe I'm just speculating likely, but I wouldn't be surprised, Cabrillo, Ferrer, Mendocino. Mendocino, because this was the viceroy of New Spain, Antonio de Mendoza, right? So who knows exactly what are the sources from this map, but it exists, it's the only one, it's in bad shape, it needs to be restored. The map itself is about 2 meters tall and so on, so they cannot put it in a vertical position to get high resolution photos. So once again, this is just a cell phone, but someone was writing down.
Is that the map of California?
Yeah, that's just a fraction. That's just a fraction. Because if I wouldn't zoom in, you wouldn't be able to see the details, right? And again, this is a telephone photo. Yeah, it's a map of California from 1604.
Can you show us the bottom of the map?
I would, sir. So before I go there, a little bit more down, there's a cape, says Cape 3 points, 3 corners. I'm convinced, but I cannot prove it, that the Cape 3 points is this point Croix, like 3 points, 1 point, 2 points, 3 points. So I think Cabrillo Bay must be around here with Drake Bay today. That's what I think it's a map, but again, I cannot prove it in a solid way. It's just my personal opinion. Okay, so that's the map, the full map. People unfolding it and see how big it is. So that zoom I made is somewhere over there, right?
Where is that map?
It's in the French National Library in Paris. In that state, as you can see, it's the only map that survived. People thought it was lost. And it says here, I zoomed this part, done by Matteo di Jacopo Nerone de Peccioli, working for the Duke of Florence in 1604. And this is all the chart is inspired in Spanish sources, but Cabrillo is written with LH. Now, what's the source? Where did Matteo Nerone got the information? Aha, that's the $1 million question. That's an easy question to make, right? I've been discussing with Marco. I'm not gonna, these are just 11 hypotheses from where the sources could be. Francisco Carletti was the first private citizen to go around the world from Italy, nowadays Italy, right? Did he got some information on the maps? Maybe. It could be Bartolomeu Lasso, Portuguese cartographer. It could be Drake and Alonso Colchero. Maybe Steve Wright will tell us about it. It could be the Jesuits in China. It could be Gabriel Tatton, another British cartographer. The Molino globe, we're going to talk about that in a few moments, the first British ever made globe. So I don't know what's the source from Nerone, and probably there are different sources as well, but we're trying to listen, we're trying to nail it down. It's an active area of research. The map from Nerone, it's by itself is enough for a paper, I think. And so Among other sources, I was telling you, we have Gabriel Patton, a British cartographer. In 1600s, he has this full map of the Pacific. You can see here it says Bahia de Cabrillo, but now with LL, written in a Castilian way. But obviously, the toponyms are different, the location is different, so likely Tatton got different sources. So I'm not sure if Tatton got information from Drake. Not clear, but these maps do exist, right? Okay, not only Bahia de Cabrillo, but we have other signatures of Portuguese cartography influence in the toponyms of California. A particularly notorious one is this Ponto Primeiro, Bahia dos Primeiros. So Lopes de Gomara wrote the general history of Indias in 1552, so about 10 years, 9 years after Cabrillo's death and the exploration of California. So he's the first to list the toponyms on the coast of California, and he goes as Puerto of Todos os Santos, Snow Cape, and Bay of the first ones, Bahia de Primeiros. Nobody ever understood what the heck is this Bay of Primeiros. And the mistake survived. Even in 1596, it became Italian. Now it's transformed in Primeiro, right? But later, in the exact same location, you see that Primeiros transformed into Pinos. Pinos is pines in Castilian. And if you know Portuguese, Primeiros and Pinheiros, Pinheiros is pines, right? It's a totally different word from Portuguese to Castilian, right? So maybe Lopes de Gomara couldn't understand the curly handwriting and what was written in Portuguese, Pinheiros, pines, he understood as Primeiros, right? So this is a tremendous mystery, but I think in fact was Bay of Pines in Portuguese, later Pinos in Castilian, which is now Monterrey, but very likely the source of whoever wrote Primeiros was written in Portuguese, Pinheiros. That's my opinion. Sounds reasonable, right? Not only that, if you go to Molyneux was a cartographer. He made the first British globe ever. Started in 1592, was remade in 1603. And you can see that in this globe, there are a couple toponyms that are written in Portuguese. Baía de Fumos, Bay of Smokes, not Castilian, Humos, but Fumos with an F. Cabo Formoso, pretty or handsome cape, not Hermoso, like in Castilian, but in Portuguese. So we have a couple toponyms here that are of Portuguese origin, right? So in other words, there were other sources in the cartography, in the very early cartography of California that necessarily had some Portuguese influence. The way they end up in the hands of Molyneux or Tatton or Neroni, something else to research, right? And speaking of which, since we are in cartography, I solved a tiny mystery. If you know Henry Warner, he is the father of all the cartography of California. He wrote, what the heck is this Gulf of Demi or Demo? I spent most of my life trying to find it. I cannot clarify what is it. And so you can see in this map of 1611, it shows there Golfo, DNI, and then super index O. So nobody managed to decipher this, but if you cross-relate other maps and the relation of the voyage of Cabrillo, it's Gulf of San Dionisio. That was the first name given to Los Angeles, right, or Santa Monica Bay. Because October the 9th, 1542, the fleet of Cabrillo went from San Pedro is known, he was there, but the relation is a bit omissive. It doesn't specifically say they were there in this side, but they say on the 10th they were on the other side. So between the 8th and the 10th, you have to cross in front of Los Angeles. And October the 9th is the day of San Dionisio. So there you go. This map from 1644, also in French, interesting, shows Gulf of San Dionisio. I wish all the mysteries were as easy as this one. But this one is solved. So Los Angeles was, or Bahia de Santa Monica was called first San Dionisio. Okay, so other than explicitly showing the name of Cabrillo and Portuguese influence in the cartography, we have solid, diversified, extra circumstantial evidence that Cabrillo was called Juan Rodrigues Portuguese in Nicaragua and Honduras. Let me show you that. So in the proof of marriage from Cabrillo's son, he says, Cabrillo, Juan Rodrigues, my father, was one of the first settlers of Nicaragua. So that's a fact, that's a primary document. The son says, yeah, Cabrillo conquered Guatemala, this and that, but he also populated Nicaragua. Again, people have been ignoring Nicaragua. So we know Cabrillo was in Nicaragua, right? But it doesn't show at all as Cabrillo in Nicaragua. He shows as Juan Rodrigues Portuguese many times. Let's have a look into that. Not sure if I'm doing too bad with time. Here we go. And so once again, trying to honor our masters, Wendy Kramer wrote in her book that it's remarkable. So in 1534, Alvarado tried to go to Peru. It didn't go well, the expedition. But in the muster roll of troops, there's a Juan Rodriguez Portuguese, and there's another one called Juan Rodriguez. According to Kramer, it's noteworthy. It's noteworthy that there is a Juan Rodriguez and a Juan Rodriguez Portuguese at the same time in the same place. So yeah, this is remarkable. Well, there are many such events. There are many remarkable events. Unfortunately, Wendy Kramer didn't dig enough, but there are many more to show. Let's have a look into those. And this doesn't support at all the so-called error of Herrera, right? And again, Kramer also failed to acknowledge that this Juan Rodriguez Portuguese was another homonym from Panama. Again, I'm honoring the master, pointing the errors that the master did. And so in Honduras, there was a coup. Alvarado took over Honduras, and we know that Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo was there, and he received some lands there, right? So this is July 20, 1536. And headquarters of the troops, about 3,000 troops, were in Tencoa, which could go to where the battle and the takeover of the government of Honduras occur. You can go by horse several times per day in this small distance, right? And we also know that leading the coup against the governor of Honduras, Andrés, there was Juan Rodriguez Portuguese, a man in the horse. And having a horse means you were rich at the time. So Juan Rodriguez Portuguese and Cabrillo, if they are different people, which I think they're not, were at most 30 kilometers apart. So the same fellows in the same place at the same time, noteworthy in the words of Kramer, right? Let's have a look at more examples. If you go to Nicaragua, to the ruins of León Viejo, was the first capital, you will find the same crew, the same group of people who were in Honduras. Now they are several years before. If you pedal back and try to find them before, here they are. Juan Ferrol, Juan de la Calle, which is Cabrillo's son-in-law, Alvar Nunes, Portuguese, that's his name, and Juan Rodriguez, Portuguese, right? Cabrillo knew Alvar Nunes. Alvar Nunes is the name of the second largest ship in the fleet of Cabrillo. So Cabrillo knew Alvar Nunes. This Juan Rodriguez, Portuguese, also knew Alvar Nunes. If he's not Cabrillo, he's like a twin of Cabrillo. He knows the same people, makes business with the same people, is in the same place at the same time. Okay, so to me, this is the oldest document that supports the Portuguese nationality of Cabrillo. This is a roster of the neighbors that should pay for the garrison to defend the mines of gold called Santa Maria de Buena Esperanza, about 50 leagues north of León de Nicaragua. I was there just a few days ago. I did 13 flights in the last 13 days. I'm a bit on the exhausted side, but so the ruins are there where they meet the gold, and they would go about 250 kilometers north. So that's the region of the mines. The natives were not friendly, and the Europeans neither. So they would send the garrison there, and the people who got the money would need to defend the garrison. What's strange is that in the second, let me continue here with the Alvar Nunes. Who was Alvar Nunes? We see Alvar Nunes showing up in the troops of Hernández de Córdoba when Nicaragua was occupied by the Spanish. But Juan Rodriguez, if it is Cabrillo, he could not show the troops because he belonged to Guatemala, right? Alvarado. So that makes sense that although Alvar Nunes came from Panama with the troops of Hernández de Córdoba, Juan Rodriguez Portuguese could not because he was coming from Guatemala, right? So that's consistent. And we also know that Alvar Nunes had a ship called Santa Maria de Buena Esperanza, exactly like the name of the gold mines. We have some documents. Again, the sum was a collection of 17 volumes of huge compilation of documents. There you go. The ship called Buena Esperanza, yes, with the Cedilia Sea. At the time, Cedilia Seas were common in Castile, not the Z's of today. And so this is the ship that very likely was later rebaptized as Santa Maria de la Victoria, the second largest ship that came to the finding of California from a Portuguese pilot. How do we know that? Because Alvarado died in 1541, and the ship was there about to sail with Cabrillo, and Alvar Nunes starts a trial. He claims, look, half of the ship was mine, the other half was from Pedro Alvarado, and he promised if my ship would go to the discovery, I would get my second half. But nobody gave me the second half, give it to me. And there it is, Alvar Nunes, Portuguese pilot. Okay? Alvar Nunes, and again, Alvar Nunes, Portuguese pilot, and so on. And many documents that support that Alvar Nunes was a Portuguese pilot. Okay, so the second time that the neighbors of León de Nicaragua have to pay for the garrison to defend the gold mines, Juan Rodriguez does not show up anymore. Why? All now to show up Alvar Nunes, Juan de la Calle, etc. Well, at this time, Cabrillo went to Europe to get his wife, right? So naturally, Juan Rodriguez disappears, Cabrillo is in Spain. Interesting, right? And when does Juan Rodriguez shows up again? When Cabrillo comes back? Exactly March 1533. We have a document that says Juan Rodriguez Portuguese brought some wine from Panama to celebrate the mass in the churches of Leon, Granada, and the gold mines, right? And this was common, people coming from Panama who bring Spanish wine to celebrate. It was done by other people. And so Cabrillo shows up 10 of March of 1533 to give the wine to those mines. And again, with the help of Master Kramer, we know that Alvarado was not far away in the Fonseca Gulf. So yeah, Cabrillo is back. So he wrote in March 5, 1533. So once again, he must be a twin of Cabrillo if he's not Cabrillo. In the same place, at the same time, in the same context. In the words of Kramer, I think this is noteworthy. Absolutely. Okay, furthermore, we have again João Rodrigues Portuguese in 1541. This is a very difficult document to make the paragraph all scratch, but so there's like João Rodrigues Portuguese, and he goes with this fellow called Pedro Rodrigues Picon. Cabrillo has business with Picon as well. Another one was Hernando Rodrigues Picon. And they go bringing horses to Buenaventura in the Barbacoas, which would be nowadays Colombia. Again, the connection with Nicaragua, Benalcazar was searching for El Dorado, yeah, the famous El Dorado from the Huizca natives, and he needed horses, he needed mules, and Raposo, Francisco Raposo was also in Nicaragua. He discovered this river full of gold, another Portuguese, the connection with Nicaragua, and that's where Cabrillo went in 1541, trading, and that explains a lot of the whereabouts, where was Cabrillo, etc., and also explains several mistakes from Kramer and Kelsey. And so I know that the other fellow that Kramer didn't identify as João Rodrigues Portuguese from Panama. He was deceased already. He was back into Spain in 1539. So it could not be this one from 1541. Okay, so we can disentangle homonyms here, right? Okay, furthermore, other Portuguese. I was in Nicaragua, I couldn't go inside this volcano. This is the Masaya volcano. It's one of the few on Earth that you can actually see the lava down there. And in 1538, a Portuguese called Antonio Fernandes with another French and Castilians went down to the lava lake, took it out with some mechanisms, some iron gloves, etc. They thought it was gold, but it's not. And the mayor of Leon said, enough, you cannot go there anymore. But this is, the records exist from Oviedo, the famous González de Oviedo. So that's how we know that Anton Fernandes is Portuguese. His name shows up as Anton Hernandez, Antonio Fernandes, etc., in other contexts. So it's the same person. And that's the only Anton Fernandes that shows up. The list of ships that Cabrillo prepared and potentially came to California, to the Philippines, as a ship called Anton Hernandez. Who is this Anton Hernandez? That's the only Anton Hernandez you can find. Furthermore, as Professor Graça Ventura was an expert on the Portuguese presence in the Americas, there was an Anton Fernandes who was a master of carpentry and making caravans. He was hired 1 year after Cabrillo. He was working in Panama, and typically everyone was going from Panama to Nicaragua because the governor himself was all. So there's a high likelihood that this Antonio Fernandes, and there were other Fernandes, other Portuguese Fernandes, owners of ships in Nicaragua. It would take too long to explain all the details. Right? And so just showing you that's another ship owner in the fleet, right? Furthermore, I also found another document where Luis Gonzalez, with the Cedilha C, not Gonzalez as a bad transcription, polygraphic transcription. So as you can see there, Gonzalez, right? He was the owner and the pilot of the smallest ship on the Cabrillo's fleet. Well, there's another one, Luis Gonzalez, the homonym. He was the boatswain of João de Gama's ship, traveled 1589, 1590 to Macau to Acapulco. So I could jump into conclusions, he's Portuguese. But you have to be careful, you cannot just jump into conclusions. At the time, Castile, there were lots of Gonzalez as well in Castile. The Zales, Z-A-L, that comes later. So I cannot be sure that this fellow is Spanish just by the name, but he could be Portuguese. So Cabrillo was Portuguese, Álvaro Nunes was Portuguese, and there's a chance now that Luis Gonzalez was also Portuguese. The three ships that explored California, maybe they were all Portuguese, maybe not. I cannot be sure with this fellow, right? Okay, so this is a quick list of the ships in Alvarado's fleet. Sorry, this is a scratch of mine, but San Salvador from Cabrillo, Álvaro Nunes, Santa Maria de Buenos Aires, Antonio Hernandez, we already saw, and San Miguel, right? So 13 ships. One of them was not in the original fleet. There was just 12, was offered by Villa-Lobos. So if you go back to Paulo the Third, this is my last slide, I'm almost done. So out of 12 ships, we can find 6 Portuguese, which is 50%, right? As Paulo the Third said in the first slide. There we go, 50% of the most important pilots, captains of Cabrillo Portuguese. Antonio Correia, who was a boatswain from Viana do Castelo. Álvaro Nunes, just mention it. Antonio Fernandes, the crazy guy who went to the volcano. Luis Gonzalez, we're not sure. And Gaspar Rico, he was the pilot major of Villa-Lobos. Again, we know he was in Nicaragua around the time, again, the Nicaragua connection. He was 25 years old. Since he died in the Pacific at this age, in 1545, he died quite young, 34, 35 years old. And there's the island of Gaspar Rico. He was also in Nicaragua, he was also Portuguese. Okay, so we have 6 of them, or 5.5, I don't know. This one I cannot be totally sure. So it reflects what the Bishop of Panama said, doesn't it? Well, if I would have more time, I would discuss what I think is the first evidence for the testament of Cabrillo. I think I found from Ferrer presented the testament to the Viceroy of Spain. Cabrillo had property in Colima who was sold in a public action. A former neighbor of Guatemala bought it but didn't pay, and so on and so on. But this is very interesting. We may have found the testament of Cabrillo, right? And that's it. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I know time passes, but I don't think I should move on to the next presenter without giving some chances of questions for this presentation, okay? Anyone would like to ask a question to Professor Paulo Afonso?
We have an amazing talk coming next. I apologize for.
Well, but at least we're not pressed as we were in the morning because of this. So we can, I'm sure we'll catch up, please.
Good question. Could the right name be Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo, naturalized of Spain, born in Portugal?
I think the right name would be João Rodrigues, not Juan.
Yeah.
Naturalized
That's
Castilian,
you're
born.
at-
Yeah, that's what I defend. I think
Except for the mispronunciation.
all things considered, I think that's the best. If you go to South Africa, you know Cape Agulhas. Agulhas means needles in Portuguese, where the geographical magnetic needles get together. There's a magnetic anomaly there. South Africa is an English-speaking country. They keep the LH. They don't Hispanicize it. So people say, oh, but in English it's always LL. It's not. It's just the over-Hispanic influence here that brings it the LH to LL. In South Africa, LA, Agulhas. It's still there. Right, please.
And my second question, is it reasonable to ask for birth records?
It is, but in those times, who had birth records? I would love to
Well,
find
they're,
it. Yeah.
they're intruders, right?
In some cases, yeah, but in some cases they burn. In some cases they don't even exist. So it's reasonable to ask. It's a good question. The answer is hard to. Yeah.
You know, I think you once told me, and I like the definition of it, that Sendo Natural was like, I'm a member of that community.
Absolutely. So I didn't have time to show, but we have many common citizens. Maria de Orobio, I'm from Portugal, but I'm a natural of Seville. Rafael de Paz, I'm a natural of Zamora, a doctor of medicine, but I'm Portuguese. So I have lists of many Portuguese citizens, natural of some Spanish city, but they say I'm from a Portuguese nation.
Can I interject? In the morning, in the presentation by Professor Cuesta Domingo, there was an example of someone from Bohemia, natural do Faial.
Martin yeah. The first ever globe made around 1492, I think, right? From Martin of Bohemia, Bohemia, the south of Germany. He's German, but there was no German back in the days. But natural of Fayal, there doesn't make him Portuguese born, they make him Portuguese naturalized, right? We have an expert here, although this tomorrow, Professor Ignacio Saldias will tell us about the complexity of all. I have to climb to these giant shoulders to know more, right? Yes, please. If I may.
I'm curious, at the very end, you said you think you found the first
Evidence.
core evidence that Cabrillo. How did he identify himself?
What happens is that the document you see is a copy of the original, and the document says João Rodrigues Cabrillo. So a B is replaced by an R, but there is no João Rodrigues Cabrillo anywhere. And why would the Viceroy and Bartolomé Ferrer interfere because of that? Bartolomé Ferrer complains to the Viceroy. He's the executor of the testament of this Cabrillo. And the guy owes money. It was the neighbor of Guatemala who knew Cabrillo. So everything, I think it was just a copy mistake, because the document itself is the copy. The original was given to Bartolomé Ferrer. And the Viceroy orders, go to Colima, and that fellow must pay the goods. And so Ferrer was executing the testament of whom? Right? And in the same context where they're discussing the sending of the ships from Cabrillo and elsewhere to go to Peru. In October 1543, the Viceroy was planning to rescue Villa-Lobos, and so he sent those ships, or other ships, this is not clear, to send horses to Peru, but there was a civil war in Peru, the ships were caught. So it's the same context of the ships of Cabrillo, Bartolomé Ferrer. The only thing that twists is a B or an R.
But how does he identify himself?
This is Ferrer, complaining to the viceroy saying, I sold the property of Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo.
Okay, so
That's what the document says.
Cabrillo or Cabrillo, it's testimony, it's
Right.
just somebody recounting.
The testament, not testimony, the will, the testament.
Or the testimony.
The testament, right? So because he says, I'm the executor of the testament, and I sold in public auction property of him, but the fellow who bought it was a neighbor of Guatemala, Cabrillo, and this Francisco Gonzalez was owning money. They registered as neighbors of Guatemala in the exact same day. So this guy owes money to this supposed Cabrillo. So I think it was just a B and an R when the copy was made. Everything contextually makes sense. That's why I'm saying it's an indirect evidence. But Cabrillo died in the sea, so you have to say, look, you're going to execute my testament. And Ferrer was his next right arm. So I think all converging, it should be the first evidence for the will, the testament of Cabrillo. Yes, please. I mean, I don't know. I know.
One last question.
Okay, didn't Cabrillo have property in Spain as well?
Uh,
And wouldn't they have executed a testament there?
His father-in-law likely had, but we don't have any evidence documented that Cabrillo had property in Spain. He had business there, his father-in-law there. He had property for sure in the kingdom in Guatemala, which at the time included El Salvador. And his son declared he was in Nicaragua, as you saw as well. But in Spain, I'm not aware of anything documented. But again, from his extended family, his father-in-law likely, yes. Thank you so much. Appreciate
Thank
your
you so
time.
much.
The next stop is much better now, please.
No, that was pretty good.
Yeah, that was amazing.
I think that was pretty darn good.
Thank you.
All right.
Right.
Oh, no, we have. Yeah, those are-
It's gonna get better and better.
It's always just a wicked point. It's
And
always-
then how do you, quick one, yeah, no, but how do you, oh, yeah.
Yes, or if you want, you can also
Yep,
put it here, but
I'm not
that's.
sure if it's-
Yeah.
Some of them.
Perfect.
Okay.
Yeah, perfect. We're all good.
All right, a lot of technology always, and
From there to here.
I mean, it's a computer. It's like-
So,
We're going on to the next presentation by Professor Andrés Reséndez. Professor Andrés Reséndez from UC Davis. He has his PA in International Relations from El Colegio de Mexico in Mexico City, and his PhD is in History from the University of Chicago. Andrés Reséndez grew up in Mexico City, where he went into politics for a brief period, you're one of those, and served as a consultant for historical soap operas. He has taught at Yale, the University of Helsinki, and UC Davis. He specializes on early European exploration and colonization of the Americas, the US-Mexico border region, and the early history of the Pacific, particularly the pioneering voyages of discovery and the biological exchanges across the largest ocean on Earth. Some of his publications include the 2021 Conquering the Pacific, which I have brought it with me and I forgot to flash it here. His 2021 Conquering the Pacific, An Unknown Mariner and the Final Great Voyage of the Age of Discovery. The Other Slavery in 2016, A Land So Strange in 2007, Changing National Identities at the Frontier from 2005 from Cambridge University Press. It's a real privilege to have you here, and we're extremely excited to hear you talk.
All right. All right, can you hear me? Yeah. Okay, very good. Okay, so first of all, a real pleasure to be here. This is a privilege really for me, especially given what I'm researching. So it's a real joy, and I thank the committee and I thank Ricardo Vasconcelos for extending this invitation. So thank you, and thank you all for coming. So we've been hearing a lot about the context, and I'm going to be a shameless storyteller in the next 30 minutes, et cetera, to tell you about the very first expedition that went across from the Americas to Asia and back successfully. It is an important expedition, as you would imagine, and as I will try to make the case for at the end. But it was also a really an incredible adventure for the people. So what I would like to do is to give you a little bit of taste of what that was like to cross the largest ocean on Earth in the 16th century. And we begin there with something that already in the morning we learned about, which is that if the Atlantic was a barrier, you can imagine that an ocean that is roughly twice as large as the Atlantic is even more of a barrier. So blazing a path across this place was not easy. So Magellan, as we've again learned earlier today, took the first step by going in one swoop, from America to Asia in 1521. This was just the first step. He didn't complete the task in the same way that Columbus did by going and coming. He just went, and then the return, the elusive vuelta or volta, remain a real problem. So in the wake of Magellan, the Spanish crown actually dispatched no less than 7 expeditions to achieve this elusive return through the Pacific, and all of them ended in disaster. So the voyage that we're going to be talking about today, this is Magellan. So you can see, I'm just looking at the Pacific side of this story. So the voyage that concerns us here really took all the benefits of the previous failures. It enlisted some of the best sailors at the time that the Spanish monarchy would have access to. It really handpicked, went all around the world. And I will talk a little bit about just what an international cast this was. It went about building the largest ships built up until this time in the Americas. And it built on some of the knowledge of the previous expeditions. So these are some of the previous expeditions. I said 7. Some of them never got too far, but these 2 in particular are very important, especially because you can actually see, well, both of them are from Mexico, from the coast of Mexico to the Philippines, the archipelago that is really more apropos as a stepping stone, so to speak, into Asia. And they were able to go there. So one in 1527, 28, this was actually Cortés himself, the conqueror of Mexico, thought about going there, but eventually he dispatched his own cousin into doing that. And then another one, the Villalobos expedition, which is related to the whole Cabrillo expedition. So the Cabrillo expedition was actually a one way to try to make it all the way to the Pacific. And this was the expedition that was a part of that big effort. But all of them ended in disaster. They tried to return, and you can see here I have the trajectory, some of these expeditions from the Philippines. They started from the Philippines and they tried to make their way back. Basically, I won't go into the very details, but basically it was relatively straightforward to go from the Americas to Asia because you could essentially go with favorable winds and currents just a little bit north of the equator. These winds are more or less dependable. But in order to get back, you really cannot come the same way because you would face contrary conditions. So you have to go way north to catch more favorable conditions to return. And finding that little patch of the ocean where you can actually do that, where you can find these favorable conditions, is extremely difficult. And you can see the result here. They tried and they even went to the wrong place, or if they found the right place, they found it at the wrong season. So the expedition that concerns us here was approved by Philip, the Spanish monarch after whom the Philippines is named. But the person who really put together the expedition was Don Luis de Velasco. He was the father. So there are 2 Velascos. Luis is the father. So he was a man who knew practically nothing about matters of the ocean. It is possible that he had never saw the Pacific, but he was the guy who hired all these pilots and under whose authority all of these great ships were built, the expedition was outrageously expensive. First of all, it was a touchy affair between the Spanish monarchy and the Portuguese monarchy, so they wanted to keep it a little secret. So instead of departing out of Acapulco, right here, which would have been the port that was more directly and best known to Mexico City, where the viceroy would have been sitting, the King's Court, where the viceregal court of Mexico. Instead, they chose a dilapidated port harbor way to the north of Acapulco that was far more difficult to access by land from Mexico City. It was also not the best the best place. So this expedition departed in 1564. But this is a map of Nueva Galicia, as this region was called at the time, from 1552, so 12 years earlier. And you can see that there was the so-called Mixton, the War of the Mixton. It was a massive uprising. You can still see natives there capturing and torturing people. You can see, natives in with bows and arrows, and these places where these ships were being built, and it took 6 years to build them. Where in these places, you can read the Spanish gloss, it says Puerto de Navidad. I have a close-up here. So look at this. So this is basically a lagoon with a couple of islands, a small settlement in the lip of sand that existed at the entrance, and then the bay. So this is what it looks like today, which, after 500 years, things do change, but you still can see the lagoon. You can still see this lip of land. We don't really know exactly where in this area where the ships were constructed. The ships were, the fleet consisted of 4 ships, one 500 tons and another one 400 tons. Just to give you a sense, the Colombian largest voyage was less than 100 tons. The largest by Ferdinand Magellan was 120 tons. So we're talking 3 times, 4 times larger than those ships. And this is not taking that much longer. I mean, this is 1560s, as I was saying. Okay. The port offered no suitable building materials, as you would imagine. This is a semi-tropical, if you go there, it's a semi-tropical area. Mosquitoes galore, you are sweating like a pig. I mean, you can imagine for somebody coming from the cool, higher altitude Mexico City, this would have been hell on earth. The incidence of illness was very prevalent, and you have to cram these people into a boat, into a ship that, even though they were the biggest at the time, they're still quite small compared to our modern ships. You cannot even begin to imagine the size of these ships compared to our modern ships. And this is how this expedition began. The hand-picked crew, as I was saying, the best possible crew available at the time. It was handpicked by the king himself, even though he was in Spain, 7,000 miles away. He actually sent letters to specific individuals ordering them that, it would be really great if you would accept to go on this expedition. So one of them was this man, Andrés de Urdaneta, who had the most sterling sailing pedigree you can imagine in the 16th century. So as a teenager, nearly 40 years before this expedition, Urdaneta had become the apprentice to none other than the captain who completed the first circumnavigation of the world, Sebastián Elcano, that we talked about earlier in the morning. He then joined the second expedition of circumnavigation, the Loaiza expedition that followed that first one. So he circumnavigated the world twice. He was stranded for 7 years in Asia, so he also had that experience over there. But then after this very adventurous life, he decided that he was tired. He went into a convent in Mexico City, and as he put it, to live out the balance of my life in quiet and peace. But this was not meant to be, as King Philip II wrote to him a letter requesting his services and thus plucking him out of his quiet retreat for one finite life or death expedition. Because remember, it was possible to go there relatively easy, but coming back was impossible up until this time. The protagonist of our expedition was this Afro-Portuguese man, Lope Martim, or Lope Martin, as he was known by the Spanish. He was a man from probably from the Algarve region, the southernmost part of Portugal, which at the time was arguably the preeminent maritime region in the world. This is where the exploration ships of both the Portuguese and the Spanish empires departed from and were staffed from, and where Black people perform some of the most menial and grueling jobs aboard these ships of exploration. So Lope Martin himself was a mulatto, as he's described there. So that is a free person of color of African ancestry. And he was an immensely talented navigator. He was one of those individuals that, you know, the moment they step aboard a sailing ship, he knows exactly what to do in any circumstance. And he was one of those. And through the years, this Afro-Portuguese man was able to climb to the pinnacle of his career by becoming a pilot. Now, this may seem like a natural progression to you from sailor to pilot, but it was nothing but natural. There was nothing natural. These were two radically different groups of people that we're talking about. This was especially the case in an era when the vast majority of the naval officers, shipmasters, pilots, etc., were white Europeans. Lope Martin was not the only mulatto pilot. There were a few others, but it was still pretty rare in the 16th century. And his trajectory was also very unlikely. So, for example, as one of the contemporaries described, sailors were mostly, and I quote, mostly ignorant and unlettered people, whereas the craft of the pilot was a notoriously technical trade, especially by the middle of the 16th century. By then, you had to be able to measure the altitude of the sun at noon with an astrolabe. You had to be conversant with the use of declination tables. You had to perform a series of mathematical calculations. So basically, you needed some training in order to do this, and the life of everybody aboard depended on the accuracy of these calculations. So this was no mere academic exercise when you were in the middle of the ocean. So somehow Lope Martin mastered all of this material, took the required courses, and passed the examinations at the House of Trade in Seville. So this is a powerful agency that not only regulated all the Spanish commerce with the Americas, but also trained and licensed all the pilots for very difficult expeditions. So the crown itself kept a stable of pilots that it trained and licensed. So he must have passed the examinations. He must have done everything that was required. Any person wishing to become a pilot, I'm going through the regulations so you get a sense, had to be at least 24 years of age, of quote unquote sound upbringing, whatever that means, and possess a minimum of 6 years experience in sailing. So it is almost certain, and again, this is a speculation on my part, we don't know, but it is quite likely that in the examiner's eyes, Lope Martin's African ancestry was a shortcoming. However, perhaps his extensive seagoing experience compensated for these problems. And God knows, Spain needed really skilled pilots, as we've been listening all day long. Additionally, according to the regulations, aspiring pilots needed to own their own nautical charts and demonstrate proficiency in mathematics, astronomy, and cartography. And so Lope Martin must have been able to do that. So he passed all the exams. There was one final problem, however, which gets us to the heart of his identity, which is the House of Trade had to certify the nationality of the trainees, of the candidates. And being a Spaniard was preferable, although not a great dealer, and everybody knew this. And because Spain needed trained pilots, and because Portugal had many of those, there was quite a bit of murkiness in this. So when the chief pilot requested proof of Lope Martim's nationality, the pilot must have done as many of his Portuguese predecessors had done, which is produce forged or irregular documents showing that he was from Ayamonte, which is the Spanish town on the Portuguese-Spanish border, but just on the Spanish side. So that is why, this would explain why most of his contemporaries believe that Lope Martim was from Ayamonte, while a few in fact call him or believe that he came from Lagos deep into the Algarve region in the other end, actually. To make sure that the application went through, Lope Martim must have added a bribe, another standard practice at that time. So House of Trade officials, no, we're not inclined to look at things too deeply. So he must have become licensed. And he was so good that he was one of the pilots, one of the 4 pilots for these super secret, no expenses spared expedition to finally crack the code of navigating the largest ocean in the world. So the expeditionaries, so we have no image of Lope Martim, unfortunately. I'm showing you an image from Waditz, showing a slave, a black slave that were very common in these voyages. This is from the 1520s, also a little earlier, but it gives you a sense of the kind of world that he would have encountered, 30 or 40 years later. So the expedition was very cosmopolitan. In the documentation, I find a Belgian barrel maker, a German artilleryman, an English carpenter, Venetian crew members, a French pilot, 2 Filipino translators, and so forth. And the Portuguese mariners made the largest and most conspicuous foreign group, at least 16 I was able to find in this expedition. Spanish regarded them as rivals, but also valued their undeniable nautical skills. So on November the 20th, 1564, all voyages bore their respective ships, got ready at 2 a.m. or 3 a.m. in the morning. I never understood why exactly they would start the expedition at that time, that ungodly time. But that's when it started. A crier said something along the lines of, "Ease the ropes of the foresail in the name of the Holy Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, 3 persons in one single true God," and on and on and on. And then, they released the ropes, they let the sails up, they raised the anchors, and off they went. In the 16th century, vessels did not come equipped with GPS or radio communications. So barely 1 week after departing from Navidad, one of the 4, so the fleet consisted of 4 vessels, one of them got separated. And that was the smallest by far. So there were 2 giant ones, a mid-sized one and a very small one, which was the one piloted by Lope Martim. That even though it was the smallest, it was the one that was leading the entire fleet. So again, maybe another clue as to the incredible skill of Lope Martim in that he was the one leading the entire fleet. But somehow he got ahead. There was this storm, got separated. The other vessels couldn't catch up. And that's how this expedition, this adventure began. You can imagine a month-long voyage without seeing anything but water. And after 1 month or 50 days at sea, you would start seeing these little teeny tiny islands that looked incredibly seductive, but they would be enormously treacherous because you could crash your boat there and you would be in deep trouble. The pilots actually took time to sketch some of these islands. You can see these little dots here show where the coral reef is. So a coral would have been, completely shred the hull of these boats. So you really didn't want to be too close to that, especially if you were running into them at night. They would have found some atolls that, which the Spanish and the Portuguese in their very rural pastoral way, they thought that they were like corrals in the middle of the ocean. But again, getting into one of those would have been incredibly stupid and dangerous. However tempting they may have been after over a month at sea and you wanted to just stop and, get your feet on the land. But again, we have sketches from this expedition about those. And we have, of course, sketches of the inhabitants of the Micronesians who lived in these little islands. And we see very eloquent testimonies of the admiration of the Spanish crew members on the navigational skill of these islanders who had spent their whole life within meters of the ocean, and they just knew instantly again what to do around the water. In the end, this is where the expedition arrived in the Philippines archipelago. The San Lucas, which is the name of that small boat piloted by Lope Martim, got separated and ended up in the southernmost large island of the Philippines called Mindanao, rounded, as much as we can tell from the sources, spent about a month in this cove, and the rest of the fleet, the rest of the Legazpi squadron, got to a more northerly area, entered through this opening arrived a week later, and even though the two fleets came close to each other, they actually never met. They never met. And so the crew of the San Lucas, so again, we're talking about 20 men in a minuscule boat. They are consuming their water, they're consuming their food, and even though they got a little bit more food in the Philippines, they are facing an agonizing choice, which is that continue to search for the other ships in order to rejoin the expedition. Go to the Spice Islands, because the Portuguese were already had established some forts, just like a week's time sail from the Philippines down south into the Spice Islands, or you could attempt the return voyage, which was their whole mission. And the San Lucas chose the third alternative, which was nothing short of absolutely suicidal, because up until that time, nobody had ever been able to do that. They did that. They had to venture into these enormous ocean that no Europeans had sailed before. I mean, Magellan would have been the closest one, but he had given up, so, I mean, not Magellan, but one of Magellan's ships. But basically, we know that this happened, and this fateful decision to proceed with the Vuelta, with the return voyage, happened almost by accident. So on Easter Sunday, April the 22nd, 1565, the ship got to the opening between the islands of Samar and Luzon in the northern Philippines. It is called the San Bernardino Strait now. And they could see that there were no more islands beyond that. So they had reached the end of the archipelago. And after passing through the strait, in that area, the currents are notoriously strong. So the currents were pushing these guys out towards the open ocean. And it was a day where there was very little wind, as are reported in the logs. So they could not really return with the sails. They would have had to row at great and to try to overcome the current that was pushing them away. So this is the situation. And so the captain of the San Lucas, Spanish nobleman, asked the pilot to, and I quote, because we have the words for that, to consider carefully the best course in the service of God, His Majesty, to save everyone aboard. And Lope Martim's reply, the pilot's reply, the exact words have reached us to reveal his awareness of that he had actually understood what it would take to accomplish this return voyage. He said that it was, and I quote, "It was best to return to Mexico because the summer season was about to start. And if we could gain enough altitude towards the north, we would find very favorable conditions. And that would be better than being captured by the islanders or by the Portuguese." So 2 points. So he was well aware that you needed to go way north in order to catch the other side of the gyre, the favorable winds and currents. But you also had to do it at the right time of the year, which was in the late spring and in the summer, which is when the winds are favorable. So everybody here knows about the monsoon, and we typically associate that with the Indian Ocean, but it actually extends into the Eastern Pacific. And these very much affect the conditions that exist in the Philippines. And these monsoon means that the wind direction shifts 180 degrees. And so if you are trying to go against that, that would have been a futile enterprise before the era of motorized, boating. This would have been impossible. Or extraordinarily difficult. So he understood that in the late spring, early summer, this is when the winds would shift. How Lope Martim got to know this is still a mystery. I mean, I have a couple of theories, but he knew, and this is what happened. So the San Lucas climb for weeks to 31 degrees of northern latitude. So, pretty north, as you can see there. They intended to stop in Japan. That was their plan. But in order to do that, you really have to go straight up, and really the currents are pushing you north, but they are also pushing you east. So they are taking you away. So the only thing that they actually could see was these remarkable rock sofugan, which I think the British sailors called it Lot's wife. But it's a very remarkable kind of rock formation that many other sailors have referred to, and it's probably this is due south from Tokyo, but a couple of 100 miles. So they really missed Japan altogether. They continued climbing too much. I mean, later, so this trajectory that I'm showing you here became established, and that was the origins of these so-called Manila galleon that for 2.5 centuries continued on, and they pretty much used some of the same trajectories, and they seldom went all the way to 42 degrees north. That is way too north. And it's too north. I mean, this is just to the south of the Aleutian Islands. And so this is what they describe, these expeditionaries describe. We faced, and I quote, the greatest cold of winter, even though it was in the middle of summer in June and July. They said lamp oil became so frozen that the bottle in which it was kept had to be warmed over a fire, and it still came out in pieces like lard. During this long passage, also the sails began to shrivel. The San Lucas carried no extra sails or mending equipment. So the crew had to hand sew the tiers with fishing line, and eventually they would even have to part with their own blankets in order to patch up the sails. But the most dangerous, interestingly to me, the most dangerous part of this expedition was not the cold or the ocean, but it was the rats. After 2 months at sea, the large rodent population became thirsty, aggressive, and ready to do anything to survive. And the only available water aboard the San Lucas was sealed in 8 casks of water. And in desperation, the rats turned to gnawing on the barrels, and one of them actually was able to perforate it and spill the contents of the barrel. So by that point, out of the 8 barrels of water that they only had 3 left, and not all of them full. So and they didn't know exactly how long it would take to get back. So this was clearly a very dire situation for them. And so to defend what little left they had of water, the expeditionaries were forced to keep a 4-man guard by the cask below deck day and night, and including putting fire, having a lit fire underneath the deck, which, as you know, if you know anything about 16th century sailing, fires were on the order of the day, and they could be extraordinarily dangerous. So this was taking their own lives in their hands, but this had to be done in order to prevent further attacks. The rodents kept attacking, and I quote again, and we killed between 20 and 30 every night. Again, this seems like an exaggeration to me, but it's possible, I guess, right? So weeks of agonizing sailing in a southwesterly direction brought the voyagers ever closer to the continent, as you could see, to the American continent, to the area where we are here today, until the evening of July the 16th, 1565, when the North American coastline became faintly visible in the distance. And it had been 3 months since they had decided to return to the Americas. So it took 3 months. So it usually took less time to go from the Americas to Asia because of the favorable conditions. It took longer to get back. From that point forward, the San Lucas voyagers must have been, must have expected a comparatively safe coastal passage to the port of Navidad, which is what I showed you before. But in fact, this is when the most dangerous moment of the entire expedition occurred. Lope Martim there was favorable. So if you know anything about winds and currents, it comes down from north to south on the coast of North America. And so Lope Martim was sensing victory and he was in a rush. And so he put all the sails out and he was running with the wind. But unfortunately, there was one of these sudden squalls that sometimes occur in this region. By the time the order was given to shorten the sails or drop some of the sails, it was too late. They were in the middle of this pandemonium. And this is how they describe it. We were suddenly hit by a blast of wind, sea, and rain, and the blow was so hard that the sail tore away from the hands of the sailors, knocking open 2 or 3 heads and flinging 2 men onto the deck. So they were not able to control the San Lucas turned a beam to the wind and the large waves. Everything above and below deck became pandemonium. And I quote another one, "We could not tell if it was land or sea." Everything on the deck was swept away along with the helmsman. So this is where the passage finally ended. This is why they lost control of the vessel right off the coast of Baja California. And so they drifted until they were able to kind of regain control, jury rig some sails. These were pretty capable sailors. And they were able to correct their course and get back finally to the coast of Mexico, to the port of Navidad. These bold passage caused a burst of excitement in Mexico. So Mexico, America, was supposed to become the axis mundi, the bridge between East and West. Yeah, I'm done. And Lope Martim and the other crew members were treated to a hero's welcome, but just for a little bit of time, as he was then accused of having deserted the rest of the fleet. You remember, like 1 week after that, and that would come back to haunt him, and eventually to result in further adventures that we don't have time to go into today. But the last point that I wanted to make is that this expedition, this 1564-65 expedition, is the pioneering expedition that established the so-called Acapulco-Manila galleon. That almost every year for 250 years, there were galleons sailing between Acapulco and Manila, taking silver from the Americas and returning with silk, porcelain, etc., other products from Asia. And these created a connection that I think we really need to explore more fully. We tend to be very focused on the Atlantic, and we have an incredible story on the Pacific that we have yet to fully come to terms with. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Andrés Reséndez. This was the book that I was mentioning. He's not going to publicize it, but I will.
Me too, it's an amazing book.
There's more to know more of this story, Conquering the Pacific, and published by Mariner. There's a question. I think there might be a question or two. Sure. We don't have too much time, but at least one question. I think we'll.
I just have a comment. That book, Conquering the Pacific, it's a hell of a read. I tell you, it's the conspiracy of moving all these people and resources to Navidad is so well told. And if you happen to be a sailor, Professor Reséndez, he is a sailor himself, so he tells you all about navigation and everything else, so you learn a lot. But it's a fascinating book. It's very, I recommend it highly.
Thank you very much.
Do the students have any questions? I know you guys are taking notes. Do you have any questions? I can see your faces when we heard about the rats part.
I have a question. Materials in Navidad to build those ships, where did that come from?
So it varied. So some of the nails, for example, were brought all the way from Spain. Some of the logs for the masts were brought from Oaxaca. The water barrels were brought from Acapulco. Some of the sails were brought from Veracruz. But the worst was the artillery pieces. They anticipated having, I mean, these were very large ships and they needed to protect them. So they brought artillery pieces all the way from Spain. Then they needed to be transported from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And so they had to put them on barges, that they had to open roads to get them all the way across through the Isthmus of Tehuantepec and then float them up to Navidad.
I want to throw in a quick one. So did you say they crossed at 31 or 41?
42 degrees of latitude.
42
Yeah,
degrees.
they went to 42 degrees latitude north. Yeah.
So I have seen that in the 1743 galleon that was taken by the British.
Yeah.
They recreated a path for it and it was at around 35 or 36 degrees.
Yes.
And I've always wondered, like, how could they cross at that? Do you have any ideas?
Yeah, well, I mean, that became the standard. As I was saying, 42 degrees, it was overshoot, it was going way too north. And this is the first one, so they really didn't know. But you don't really want to be so far north to get into these squalls close to the Aleutian Islands. You really want to be a little further south where you can still find these river of currents and winds that take you to the American continent. So that was the standard, 36, 34 degrees of north.
Did they know anything about Great Circumnavigation then? The Great Circle route, where it's
I mean,
it's a shorter route?
yeah, no, this is what they stuck with once they found it. So, yeah.
A very quick question. There was a fellow called João Yanes. He was a Portuguese boatswain in the Patácio São Lucas.
Yeah.
And in the second part of the adventure, we didn't have time to tell when they're stranded in the atoll, right?
Yeah.
João Yanes stays with Lope Martim, but you said there were 16 other Portuguese, but not in the Patácio, maybe in the other ships.
In the other ships,
Okay.
yeah.
Anything else you know about João Yanes?
Very little, I mean, I can dig in my notes.
I think he was quite close to Lope Martim, right? And made
Yeah,
for the
oh,
South.
yeah, no, totally. I mean, this insurrection occurred because of the help with all the Portuguese.
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much again. Computer is. I just don't want an extra computer at the end of the day. So, oh, it's there. I'm going to introduce now Steve Wright. Guys, I love the part when Martin says, well, we don't want to meet the Portuguese halfway.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
I mean, he was probably freed slave, so it makes a lot of sense, right?
Yeah.
Steve Wright is a retired public school teacher and served as the 5th president of the Drake Navigators Guild. After a 5-year term, he stepped down and continues to contribute as a director and holds the title of President Emeritus. Wright is also the editor of the Guild's newsletter, the Bowsprit. He has presented at various venues, including the Society for California Archaeology's annual conference, Point Reyes National Seashore, and conferences of the North American Society for Oceanic History. So welcome, Steve. I want to pass you the microphone.
Thank you.
I think our presentation is loaded. Well, after Steve's talk, we'll have our coffee break and then we'll give the final presentation. Thank you so much.
Which button do I push here?
You don't have to push on. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yes, hello there. I am Steve Wright, and I am from the Drake Navigators Guild. And I deeply appreciate being part of this presentation, this conference here, and especially want to give thanks to Paulo Afonso for his bringing this to my attention, and also his prompting for me to look into what he alluded to earlier in his presentation about looking into that avenue of influx of the cartographic information that somehow made it onto the Molyneux globe? And was there a Drake connection? And also, please forgive and be patient with my poor Spanish and Portuguese pronunciation. The only language with which I can even get by a little with, besides English, is German. Meine Mutter kommt aus Deutschland. So, a little bit about the Drake Navigators Guild here. Okay, this is the wrong one.
The mouse, yeah.
Okay.
I think it's probably to the side. Is it this? So you can also. Nancy, please. I think it's.
We opened the file.
It's just not open. Is it this?
Yes.
Oh, okay, which one?
So it kind of is more on the
Okay.
inside. Okay, cool. Thank you.
Yeah, so the Drake Navigators Guild is a Northern California-based history society. We were formed in 1949. We're dedicated to researching information about Francis Drake's landing on the California coast in 1579. There we go. We've had a number of numerous notable members. When our Fleet Admiral Chester Norrens was one of our charter members, and Pulitzer Prize winning Admiral Samuel Eliot Morrison was a longtime member of the Guild. Lord Mountbatten from England was a member up until he was assassinated, and a current member, Dr. Barry Goff from Canada. And the president I followed was Edward Von Deporten, who discovered and led the archaeological investigation of the Manila galleon, the San Juanillo, which lies wrecked on the Baja California coast. Our work has also resulted in state and federal landmarks at the Drake's Bay, California. We've also launched the digital journal, the Bowsprit, and we really welcome papers for publication. So please contact us through our website should you or someone know like to help us with a submission. When Francis Drake embarked from Plymouth, England on November 15, 1577 to begin his circumnavigating expedition, he did so amidst declining strength of the English Navy and the persistent Cold War tension between Spain and England, which fostered the rise of corsairs. Drake recognized the perilous, unfamiliar nature of his journey, one that would take him into dangerous, vaguely documented and utterly unfamiliar waters. With this understanding, he would augment his talents and those of experienced pilots. And he bolstered preparedness by carrying charts he purchased in Lisbon, charts made specifically for the journey. Drake considered enlisting foreign pilots a minor challenge, confident that the threat of death would swiftly compel their cooperation. Drake's exceptional maritime skills were evident in his uneventful nonstop voyage from Java to Sierra Leone, in fact, a feat unmatched even by the late 18th century. Portuguese pilot Nuno de Silva held Drake in high regard, referring to him as a great mariner. However, Drake understood the mission's demands went beyond his personal abilities, and local pilots would significantly enhance the nautical capacity of the English expedition. Among the pilots pressed into service were 4 Portuguese mariners, Nuno de Silva, Gaspar Martin, Custodio Rodriguez, and João Pascoal. Their greatest worth emerged through their intimate familiarity with the region in which they were seized, guiding Drake much like a skilled boxer is coached to duck and slip his opponent's punches. With his pilot's advice, he remained agile, navigating to safety in perilous circumstances. Drake's lack of knowledge had cost him tremendously during his early incursion into the Pacific, particularly when seeking water. 3 times, Drake's crew faced sudden attacks, resulting in their immediate deaths of 5 men and injuries to approximately 10 others, including Drake himself, and some who would later succumb to their wounds. These unexpected assaults proved too much for the English crew to bear, and pressing pilots into service mitigated these issues. The first of these 4 Portuguese pilots who unwillingly fell into Drake's service was Nuno de Silva, whom the Englishman would seize along with his ship, the Santa Maria, within the waters of the Cape Verde archipelago of Santiago. A Portuguese resident of Guaia, who was born in Porto, much is known about him due to the numerous extant Spanish records, including his logbook, depositions, and ancillary documents. He began his seafaring life while very young and first crossed the Atlantic as an 8-year-old boy under the tutelage of his uncle, Reséndez, a pilot who took him to Brazil. He once faithfully served the Englishman from January 1577 until his abrupt discharge from Drake's flagship, the Golden Hind, in April 1579. De Silva, the only pilot Drake would use in both the Atlantic and Pacific, provided charts that extended to the River Plate and the Cape of Good Hope. With Drake in the Atlantic, De Silva unquestionably saved the flotilla from destruction, first with his adept piloting the expedition through foggy and rocky lee shore, Brazil, and second with his warning to Drake not to enter the Bay of Todos os Santos due to the presence of Portuguese galleys. Since Drake held De Silva after the geographical familiarity stalled with south of the River Plate, the Englishman must have been impressed with De Silva's ability and realized that his skills would continue to be an asset to his mission in the Pacific. Consequently, it was likely through transiting the Magellan Straits in an incredible 14 days and surviving the subsequent 15 days of furious weather in the Pacific, tempest that resulted in the loss of 2/3 of Drake's small flotilla, that De Silva rendered his most impressive service. De Silva accompanied Drake as the English corsair successfully raided Spanish ships and towns by taking copious amounts of loot and inflicting little physical harm. For reasons unknown, Drake abruptly abandoned De Silva when he sailed from Huatulco, Mexico on April 16, 1579. After enduring the rack at the hands of the Spanish inquisitors, De Silva was eventually sent to Europe for a congenial meeting with King Philip II, and evidence strongly suggests that Drake belatedly compensated the misused Portuguese mariner. De Silva acclimated well to his life with the English crew. Spanish witnesses recounted that he was fully accepted and treated well by Drake, as is evidenced by his participation in the English crew's Protestant religious services and his regular presence at Drake's table. Often prisoners noted De Silva's silence in their presence, likely his defensive ploy to avoid an Iberian identification and association. All considered, De Silva's services were invaluable to Drake, one whom the distinguished historian John Suchet counts among the finest of his day. Drake continued his steady practice of pressing pilots on December 5th, 1578, at Valparaiso, Chile, when he conscripted his first Pacific pilots, a Greek named Juan Griego, who was aboard the ship the Capitana. Unlike Silva, Drake would temporarily hold these other pilots, typically for a matter of several weeks, before granting them release. Shortly before arriving at Caio de Lima, the next Portuguese pilot whom Drake pressed into service was Gaspar Martim. Little is known of the mariner due to the dearth of information about him from both Spanish and English sources. The English witnesses include Drake's chaplain, Francis Fletcher, and John Drake, the cousin of the elder Francis. Neither John Drake nor Fletcher mentions the pilot by name, but both refer to the incident in which his frigata, also referred to as a bark in many of the English witnesses, was seized. John Drake's 1584 testimony reads, in January 1579, they reached Caio de Lima and entered between the island San Lorenzo Island and the mainland, being piloted by a Portuguese whom they had seized in a bark that was 6 leagues at sea. In the bark, he carried silks and merchandise, but nothing was taken from him. De Silva adds information by implying the pilot owned the small ship. Fletcher's account of the encounter with the Portuguese pilot has some differences, including the theft of the linen. Yet in this passage, we met another bark, Fletcher writes, loaded with linen, some of which we thought might stand us in good stead, and therefore took it with us. In addition to the discrepancy about looting linens, Fletcher mentions nothing relating that Martim was pressed by Drake. Moreover, he indicates this encounter to have been during the second week of February. Nuno de Silva's account of the matter is brief and also places the raid in the same area. Being 7 or 8 leagues from the haven of Caio de Lima, They espied 3 ships, and boarding one of them, they took 3 men out of her, and so held on the course towards Cayo Lima. Only noting that prisoners were taken from the ship, de Silva is silent regarding Martin's name, so it is difficult to ascertain the further facts of his imprisonment. If Martin was deposed, those records remain lost, and there are no extant accounts of other witnesses to indicate the Portuguese pilot's testimony was ever recorded. Nicholas Jorge, a Flemish pilot working aboard a ship that rested at anchor in the port of Arica, was pressed into service by Drake on February 5, 1579. Consequently, he was aboard the Golden Hind when the Englishman fell with the Martin ship, a mariner Jorge knew. Speaking later with Drake, Jorge discovered that the corsair had learned details about 3 nearby treasure ships through comments made by Gaspar Martin. Drake was unable to seize 2 of these ships, those of Miguel Angel and Andrés Muriel, both which carried much silver. However, Martin informed the English corsair about San Juan de Anton's fabulously laden ship, the Nuestra Señora de la Concepción, also known as the Cacafuego. I hope you're not too offended. Oh, good. Okay.
It's just fun.
Spitfire, right, would be.
Yeah, Spitfire, yes. In addition to, well, what I understand is this, that there were a lot of Nuestra Señora de las and so on in the Spanish fleet. And so typically these ships were given colloquial names by the sailors. And I was a young man once, and I know that young men are full of it, okay? And so Cacafuego makes sense. After Drake unloaded the silver, one of the young Spanish sailors said, maybe we should call this ship the Caca Plata.
Steve, if you allow me, I don't want to interrupt you too much, but some of the primordial sources, they say Sacafuego, because the first C is a cedilla.
Oh, okay.
So it was the cedilla, and so maybe it was the saca, like put away fire, but saca or caca.
Later, it is also, I've come across some Spanish descents call it the Naurica. Rich. Not rich. Right. So, yes, so this provided Drake. Okay, Cacafuego, there we go. In addition to informing Drake that it was sailing for Panama, he also indicated that it was stopping at other ports along the way to take on loads of flour. This provided Drake with the information he needed to begin stocking the ship. Jorge was cautiously precise in his testimony about Martin and that he did not directly implicate the pilot regarding the matter of assisting the Englishman with the information. Rather, he specifically referred to knowing about this conversation from Drake, and it's clear that he did not witness Martin assist the Englishman with this critical knowledge. Jorge does what he can to protect his colleague by stressing his testimony's hearsay nature. From firsthand experience as Drake's captive, he understood the difficult situation Martin faced. The next encounter with a Portuguese pilot was at the port of Paitá, Peru, on February 20, when he pressed 50-year-old pilot Custodio Rodriguez into service aboard the Golden Hind. Possessing a frigata, Rodriguez was in the port at Paitá while engaged in coastal cabotage, and on this particular trip, he was transporting various wares, including wine, wax, and a native canoe, each of which Drake purloined. Upon securing these items, Drake also pressed Rodriguez into service, sailed his vessel out to sea, and cast it off to complicate any Spanish pursuit. Rodriguez supplied Drake with vital information regarding the Cacafuego, informing him that she was 2 days ahead. This prompted the corsair to set sail immediately in pursuit. Once the Golden Hind caught up with her, the Englishman spent 6 days retrieving the treasure, which included 26 tons of silver bars, 14 chests of silver reals, and 80 pounds of gold. This haul constituted about half of the English crown's annual revenue. And without Rodriguez's assistance, Drake very well may not have acquired this treasure. Rodriguez gave good account of his, and I should say, and Martin's assistance, who first put him on the onto the trail of the Cacafuego. Rodriguez gave good account of his and his fellow prisoners' detention at the hands of Drake by saying they were treated well, while only complaining about having to eat meat on Friday during Lent. However, with a considerate note, you read those when you read those the depositions of the prisoners, they were taken largely, not entirely, but largely by clergy. And so there was a lot of, what rules were you breaking?
Inquisition, huh?
Yes, yes, absolutely. So okay. However, with a considered note, he explained this was because they were Lutherans and gave them to eat what they eat themselves. Moreover, Rodriguez includes an important detail about Drake by stating that he had left England with a license from the Queen to rob. The Spanish records of the time tend to reflect Rodriguez's view that Drake was licensed since they avoided using the word pirata in favor of cosario, a term which denoted raiders who operated under the auspices of a relevant political authority. This was important evidence to the Spaniards because it implied that the English authorities sanctioned Drake's activities, a political matter very different than common piracy. Instead of being robbed by an individual renegade mariner and his band of outlaws, Rodriguez's report indicated that the Spanish people were being assaulted by England, an international relations problem, rather than a policy matter regarding pirates. Rodriguez gave false testimony about Nuno da Silva, albeit in good faith. In his report to the authorities, he identified da Silva as another pilot whom he knew well and not a noted criminal. This was a case of simple misidentification and ultimately disbelieved, as testified to by da Silva's eventual repatriation to Europe. In the end, Drake left Rodriguez with Anton before sailing on, and in the next few weeks would soon encounter another Portuguese pilot. On April 4, 1579, Drake seized the ship of Spaniard Don Francisco Zarate off the coast of Guatemala as she made her way to Peru. And he did so with little commotion, approaching them with skilled deception aboard the Golden Hind until his bark, a frigata belonging to Rodrigo Tello, that the Englishman took off Cano Island on March 13, 1579. The English crew easily captured the ship with arquebus warning shots, and the Spaniards offered no resistance as the Englishmen politely boarded the ship. Aboard Zarate's vessel was the Portuguese pilot, João Pascoal, who would guide Drake to his final stop in Spanish-occupied territory, a raid on Huatulco, Mexico. Much of what we know about Pascoal comes from his two depositions given to clerical authorities. The first deposition taken on March 5, 1580 in Acapulco, Mexico, and the second on May 13, 1580 in Huatulco, Mexico. Pascoal stated that he was a 26-year-old native of Villanova de Portimao, the current city of Portimao in the southernmost province of mainland Portugal. Much of the cleric's line of inquiry followed religious matters, particularly regarding da Silva's participation in Lutheran services. The two Portuguese pilots never conversed. Consequently, Pascoal could only offer observations about da Silva's religious affairs. After Drake seized the ship, the Spanish vessel's crew found themselves deftly separated, and before the end of the first day of captivity, Drake specifically summoned Pascoal, likely suspecting Pascoal's pilot's status. Initially, Drake asked Pascoal about the nearby availability of water, to which Pascoal replied, "I don't know," a lie, because he was very familiar with the area, but his feigned ignorance would soon be revealed, and under duress, Pascoal accompanied Drake to the Golden Hind. When Pascoal boarded Drake's flagship, he and a pilot previously captured aboard Tello's bark, Alonso Sanchez Cochero, recognized each other. Taking the initiative, Cochero approached Pascoal, embraced the young man, engaged him in conversation, and calmed his companion's fears about being killed by the Englishman. But before long, the situation grew a bit awkward and rather tense between the two comrades when Cochero slyly decided to assist the Englishman with helpful information about his young colleague to Drake. He told the English corsair, "This youth will take you to where there are water and fuel, for he knows very well where they are." Unready to acquiesce, Pascoal pluckily replied, "It is true that this man knows me, but I know nothing of latitude or things about navigation, and I could but poorly guide you to where there are water and fuel." Drake, one intimately aware with the ways of deception, disbelieved the betrayed Pascoal and declared that he would hang and behead the Portuguese pilot should he refuse to cooperate. Choosing the better of two poor options, Pascoal guided Drake to Huatulco, while Cochero was released with Zarate. Once the small town was firmly under English control, Drake had Pascoal shackled, taken from into the harbor, and put aboard the frigata, where Pascoal informed his captors where they could acquire water. By taking the corsairs into the small port town, Pascoal also provided a location that offered the Englishmen much needed food and clothing. These supplies were crucial for the success of the voyage's next leg. Drake was about to depart Portugal would not make landfall for 2.5 months. Along with the Silva, Drake released Pascual on Holy Thursday before setting sail west into the Pacific the next day. In 2 subsequent depositions, Pascual gave testimony to De Silva's participation in the Lutheran services, but not so much to entirely damn De Silva. The said Englishmen prayed twice a day and carried with them a Portuguese who was now in Mexico and who also prayed with them and ate with them. For the witness does not know whether he said the same prayers as those of the Englishmen. And as a former prisoner of Drake, one compelled to act against his convictions, Pascual demonstrated some kindness and empathy for De Silva with this testimony. Pascual was also a target of a bit of Drake's devious nature through some disinformation delivered by Drake's trusted companion, Diego. According to La Santiati Valverde, when Pascual was in the Corsair ship, he met one day at the prow with the Negro Diego, who inquired of him secretly, "Where's the port of Colima?" When I'm going to the Spanish now, this is what it says. Juan Pascal answered, telling him that it was beyond New Galicia. The Negro said, "I think we're going there. Withdraw yourself from me. Do not let yourself be seen speaking to me." Drake was a master of misdirection. This verbal feint served to muddle the Spanish minds to where Drake was headed after leaving Huatulco. Determined to be truthful in his deposition of Spanish inquisitors, Pascual has some final words to say about the Englishman, noting that he did not see Francis Drake do harm to anyone. On the contrary, he made them eat at his table. When pressed by the inquisitors as to why he helped Drake find water, Pascual simply and effectively responded that Drake would have killed him. With that statement, Drake not only motivated Pascual to cooperate, he also effectively provided Pascual with a valid alibi to defend himself against charges from the Spanish officials. All in all, Pascual faithfully served out his oath to state the truth. There is an additional possible connection Drake may have to the Portuguese Pacific mariners, one that may indirectly link Drake to Cabrillo and his exploration along the Alta California coastline. Information regarding the coastline of Alta California that Cabrillo had explored and charted may have found clandestine path to Europe, possibly through Drake. This potential link underscores the dynamic flow of information about California's coastline, which contributed to the increasingly refined geographic insights reflected in the 1592 Molyneux Globe. André Holman's 1559 map is significant work by the Portuguese cartographers, among the earliest detailed representation of California's toponyms, aligning closely with descriptions of Lopez de Gomara's 1552 book, History of the Indies. However, Holman's map omits certain geographic features in Portuguese toponyms along Alta California, such as Cabo Formosa and Bahia dos Fumos. These omissions were later rectified in Emery Molyneux's 1592 Globe, indicating that an influx of cartographic information revealing Spanish geographical knowledge had reached English awareness. The Globe was crafted by Molyneux, an English mathematician and instrument maker involved in seafaring and geographic circles, and it was engraved by the Flemish immigrant Judocus Hondius. Questions exist regarding the vexed matter of identifying the conduit for this inflow of information to England. Cabrillo's toponyms may have been gleaned in 1579 by Drake, when he took 2 Manila galleon route pilots as prisoners. Moreover, Drake may have returned to England with the purloined charts and submitted them to his superiors. When the English crew intercepted Rodrigo Telo's frigata, Drake made one of his most fortuitous seizures aboard the small ship where 2 trans-Pacific pilots, Martin de Aguirre and Alonso Sanchez Colchero, who were sailing from Nicoya to Panama. This is the same Colchero who was acquainted with Rodriguez. When Drake forced the unwilling Colchero to serve him, he gained the pilots 2 navigation maps and collection charts. These charts, likely based on ones drawn by Andrés de Urdaneta, not only contain crucial data for the Manila route, but likely included information about the northwestern coast of America explored by the Cabrillo expedition. Drake fully understood the treasure he confiscated from Colchero and stated that he would send him material to Elizabeth, a topic of which he had unambiguous directions. Elizabeth had placed restrictions on Drake about charting and possessing cartographic materials, constraints that were unequivocal orders. Elizabeth specifically prohibited the English sailors from charting their voyage without Drake's sanction, and any cartographic material Drake obtained on this voyage, such as Colchero's, was to be promptly surrendered upon return to England. In order to safeguard the details of the journey, the information from the voyage was kept confidential in the months following Drake's return to England in September 1580. During his 6-hour audience with Elizabeth in early October, Drake surrendered his log and a large map which he and his young cousin John Drake had drawn, a map Zerati bemoaned due to the work's accuracy. It is difficult to imagine that Drake would avoid including this valuable information he had gleaned from Colchetto on the map had he and his cousin had designed. But this is a view of which we cannot be certain. Nonetheless, their map was only shared with trusted officials upon the Golden Hind's return to England. But what happened to the charts Drake seized from Colchetto is a mystery. It is incredibly doubtful that he returned them to Colchetto. So did Drake retain possession of them, or did he follow his orders and submit them to Elizabeth as he had his other materials? Although Drake was not known for his strict adherence to orders, his defiance typically arose from when he could take advantage of circumstances in pursuit of personal gain. However, in this situation, such circumstances did not exist. He was not inclined to outright disobedience against his sovereign, risking all he had just attained. Almost certainly, Drake would have surrendered to Elizabeth all the charts confiscated from Colchetto. Nonetheless, the records are silent on this matter. However, records indicate that 2 other manuscript maps from Drake were eventually released to others that could have been the source of fresh New World information. One map was to the Archbishop of Canterbury, likely Drake's friend, Edmund Grindal, but the fate of this map is not known. Additionally, Henry IV of France requested that Elizabeth send him the collection of charts from the voyage. An originally designed map was delivered to Paris. However, in the 1970s, it was discovered that it was lost. The map and log Drake surrendered have also been lost, presumably perishing in the 17th century Palace of Whitehall fire. With this loss, we do not know if any destroyed maps had depicted elements and toponyms that Drake garnered from Colchetto. While they may have contained information gleaned from the Portuguese pilot's material, it is possible to confirm this scenario. Another possible avenue for Colchetto's chart to affect Alta California toponyms on the Molyneux globe could be through the cartographer Jodocus Hondius. Remember, he's the one who engraved the globe. He likely was one of the privileged few who viewed Drake's map after he submitted it to Elizabeth. If this is the situation and Drake had indeed used Colchetto's information to label his own map of Alta California with Cabrillo's toponyms, Hondius could or would have seen them. Equipped with this information, Hondius could have applied them to the globe he engraved. However, this string of events, while plausible, must be viewed as very unsettled. Complicating the matter is that other plausible conduits exist. Helen Wallace, keeper of maps at the British Library, suggested Pedro Sarmiento de Gamboa, Drake's Spanish adversary, influenced the cartography featured in the Molyneux globe. During his stay in London as a prisoner in the congenial custody of Sir Walter Raleigh, it appears that Gamboa provided information that found its way onto the globe, particularly evident that in the globe's depiction of the Strait of Magellan and the discovery of the Solomon Islands. While it remains uncertain whether Gamboa possessed or recalled precise knowledge of the toponyms of Alta California, or whether he shared such information with the English is a factor that cannot be entirely dismissed. Moreover, the information may have been facilitated by Thomas Cavendish's audacious assault on the Spanish Manila galleon, the Santa Ana, 1587. It's possible he could have seized detailed Spanish maritime information about Alta California and carried them to England. Additionally, we should consider that this cartographic information may have originated from an outlaw Iberian pilot. Decades before Drake set sail in the spring of 1553, a group of London merchant adventurers formed a syndicate that organized an expedition to Benin, the first voyage to that African region by Englishmen. Key to their plans was enlisting the services of a renegade Portuguese pilot, Antonio Anes Penteado, who was experienced in navigating African waters. Sailing from Portsmouth on August 12 under the command of Thomas Wyndham, the expedition eventually reached Benin before returning home with valuable cargo that included ivory and 150 pounds of gold. It is not unreasonable to suggest that another Iberian pilot might have engaged in similar subterfuge to provide Pacific maritime information at other moments over the next 4 decades. Nevertheless, establishing an Iberian source or Gamboa, Cavendish, or Colchetto as the origin of English intelligence concerning Cabrillo's North American exploration remains very elusive, entirely speculative, likely impossible. While the historiography of Alta California's cartographic influence is incomplete and unsettled, it is abundantly clear that Francis Drake's multiple encounters with Portuguese pilots were crucial to the success of the Corsair's historic navigation and consequently England's maritime ascension. Thank you very much for your kind.
I'd like to open the discussion for any questions to Steve Wright, please. And a big Paulo with it.
Steve, wonderful. How did Gamboa end up arrested in London? And the second question, Simão Fernandes, I think he knew Molineux, right? He was the pilot of the Roanoke Island first attempt of the English to set the colony.
Right, yeah, Raleigh, yes.
So do you think Simão Fernandes could have been on that list maybe as well? And then in Gamboa, please.
Right, so Gamboa, and this is a bit out of my wheelhouse, okay? What I recall, Raleigh was in charge of a fleet that engaged in battle with the Spaniards, possibly off the Azores. Gamboa was captured in battle.
Also in Azores.
Yes, and so it was an odd situation that when they took Gamboa back to England, typically these prisoners were held for ransom. They didn't do that with Gamboa and held him and treated him well and then released him back to Portugal. Spain. Yeah.
So I knew Gamboa was more in the Peru Pacific route, but
Yes.
this time was Azores, right?
Yes, yeah, that's where he did most of his work, really. Yes.
Other questions? So thank you once again to Steve Wright. Right, great to restart now. We had an awesome turnout with more students. Extremely happy. I'm extremely happy to introduce our next guest, our next speaker, Professor Loris Banegas. It's particularly my pleasure also because he's a colleague here at CSU. Senior colleague also from CSU. Chicano studies. It wouldn't make sense, as I said today at the opening of the conference, the opening remarks with President Ella and Dean. It wouldn't make sense these days to be talking about Portuguese or Spanish at that point. Portuguese navigations in the Pacific and Alta California and context in this area, without actually having in mind the stories as it is told and the stories of the American indigenous populations. And so it's resonates between that. Without any further ado, I'm introduce Ethan Loris Banegas, a descendant of the Kumeyaay, Luiseño, and Cabrillo, bands of Native Americans, and I apologize. He grew up on the Banona Reservation in San Diego County. He received his Bachelor of Arts in History, Religious Studies, and Political Science in 2009. And his Master of Arts degree in History, and he has a Master of Arts degree in History in 2017 from the University of San Diego. Banegas is the owner of kumei.com and historian for the San Diego History Center, which for those of you who weren't here in the morning, the second day of the conference tomorrow is actually at the San Diego History Center for the morning, and in the afternoon we'll go to the Maritime Museum. In the History Center, which operates the Junipero Serra Museum. He currently teaches in the American Indian Studies Department at SDSU, and we see a lot of his students, and we're very happy that we are all here to have multifaceted, polyhedric conversation. So thank you, Ethan, for accepting our invitation.
Thank you, Ricardo. It's an honor to be here. There's a lot of my students from class, way more than I imagined. It's probably because of 5 points of extra credit. Right?
Yeah, extra credit.
Yeah, so, wow, it works. All right, Alka, my name is Ethan Banegas. I'm a citizen of the Brona Band of Mission Indians. I currently teach. Excuse me while I get my slide presentation to accompany my lecture.
It's not working.
It's on YouTube right now.
No, it's streaming to YouTube. It's live streaming.
Okay.
But it's just.
All right, there we go.
So if you just push.
Very fancy.
High tech. It's like
High tech. I currently teach at the San Diego State University in the American Indian Studies Department. I also, yes. Go Aztecs, Aztec football rules. I spent 5 years before this at Kumeyaay College, specializing in Kumeyaay history. Before I begin this brief presentation, I want us to ask two questions to start our conversation. One, why are we celebrating history, this history in particular? And I know this conference isn't here to just celebrate Cabrillo, but this is what it's like to be a Kumeyaay person in San Diego. That's what I'm here to demonstrate to you today. Also, who is telling the story? So keep those questions in mind, please. In San Diego County, Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo is celebrated as the very first European explorer to reach the West Coast, or more accurately, Alta California. His first point of contact was right here in present-day San Diego, where he would encounter my ancestors, the Kumeyaay people. The question today is, what was this encounter about? As well as, perhaps more importantly, what is that significance today for my tribe, the Brona tribe, and the other 13 Kumeyaay reservations? So right here we have Viejas represented, called 2 Viejas folks. What's up, Viejas? Right? And a couple of, there's 10 more or less. So I'm here as a representative to demonstrate what it means to us, this history in particular. After visiting several monuments and museums up and down the coast of California, and teaching close to a dozen different college courses, my eyes are open to a familiar trend in North American history. From the Native American perspective, Spanish and Portuguese history often takes center stage at the expense of Indian and yes, even Mexican history. Today, I'm not advising we erase Portuguese and Spanish history. Rather, I advise we put the first things first and place Spanish and Portuguese history in its right place. Before 3 waves of encroachment, keep wanting to go to the laptop. There were 3 waves of encroachment: Spanish, Mexican, and American in that order. Approximately 20,000 Kumeyaay people lived in 85 villages in an area the size of Delaware. That's our ancestral lands. About every 6 miles, there was a village with approximately 3 clans in each village. Each Shmuel or clan was steward of its own individual sovereign territory, with approximately 200 to 1,000 clan members. Clans and villages were linked by an intricate array of kinship networks. This intricate clan structure was devastated from the first Spanish settlement in Casoy, the site of the first mission, and Nipawai, the site of the second mission, which represented the first break in the link of the chain. Disease, old world animals, and Hispanization, and especially bad evangelization, were most disruptive to the Kumeya's traditional way of life. Now here we have a modern map. As you see, these are ancestral lands, the total area. And today we have our present land base, which is, as you see, significantly smaller. Hamul is actually the smallest reservation in the country at an acre. So it's not a lot, right? So, but we have 13 Kumeyaay reservations and 4 ejidos in Mexico. Contrary to popular belief, Christopher Columbus did not discover a new world. He discovered a very old and ancient world with civilizations and populations that rivaled those in Europe. The pre-contact indigenous population in the US and Canada was upwards to 18 million. Importantly, Christopher Columbus and Vasco Núñez de Balboa never touched foot on the shores of America. Yet we name our rivers, universities, streets, towns, and yes, San Diego's world famous Balboa Park after them. In this slide, I want to show you the world famous Hotel del Coronado. In the other photo, we have here the bridge, Coronado Bridge, as well as the city of Coronado in the background. Importantly, Coronado, like Columbus and Balboa, never set foot in San Diego County. On this slide, we have Cabrillo's National Park in Ocean Beach. Really awesome monument as far as space goes. I really enjoy this spot. But it's important to understand who Cabrillo was to the Native Americans. Importantly, Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo was a conquistador who laid siege to Tenochtitlan in 1519 and was an accomplice to Hernan Cortez, responsible for leveling the beautiful city of Tenochtitlan, destroying the heart of the Aztec civilization and culture. Here we have Cortez on an expedition, or his exploring the Baja California as well as Mesoamerica in 1535, making it all the way to La Paz. And this would be a failed colony. Next, he would send an explorer named Francisco to sail the Baja Peninsula, and these are Oscar's slides. Thank you, Oscar. And this is where we would find and name the Sea of Cortez, as well as discover California is not an island. 3 years later, you would have Cabrillo in 1542 sail to Point Loma, spending only 4 to 5 days in San Diego, not very long. Then he would leave to the Channel Islands, where he died of complications from an infected, shattered limb. So here's a brief kind of bullet points of Cabrillo, and here. So today's September 26th, so 2 days from now. I think that's why we're celebrating it now, right?
That's why we're talking about it.
Yeah. You would seek access to Asian markets, name it San Miguel, and eventually die in the Channel Islands. Of course, this was a failed expedition, and he would discover currents flowed from north to south. This next slide, I want to show an excerpt from a book, San Diego, California's Cornerstone. I'll give a shout out to Iris real quick. She is both a friend and mentor. So I went to school at USD in my undergraduate and graduate school. So I was actually schooled pretty well on San Diego's Hispanic history from Iris. I actually learned this history before Kumeyaay history. So let me read an excerpt, and I will demonstrate essentially the encounter Cabrillo had with the Kumeyaay people. It reads, excuse me, let me get some water. Does anyone have a throat lozenge? I think it's too late for that. The Spaniards stepped ashore and were greeted by friendly Indians, whom Cabrillo described as well-built and clothed in animal skins. The admiral bestowed the name of San Miguel after Saint Michael Archangel, upon this newly discovered, closed and very good port. But it has changed 60 years. It was changed 60 years by Sebastian Vasciano, the Spanish navigator who chose instead to honor San Diego de Alcalá. 3 Indians timidly approached Cabrillo's ship, indicating by signs, indicating by signs that they knew of each other, similarly dressed white men carrying crossbows and swords, traveling inland. Cabrillo understood from their gestures these strangers, which is probably a detachment from Coronado's expedition, wielded lances from horseback and had killed many Indians. For this reason, the California natives were afraid, but the Spaniards gave them presents and calmed their fears. When Indians wounded 3 seamen in a night fishing party near the shore, Cabrillo ordered his crew not to fire on them, but to win their confidence. Sailing from San Diego after 6 days' rest, the expedition sighted the Channel Islands off San Clemente and Santa Clarita, where their story ends. So it's pretty much it as far as the encounter goes of Cabrillo's. So out of all those 3 people, Cabrillo actually did touch foot here compared to Balboa and Columbus. Interestingly, runners from the east arrived before Cabrillo in 1542. Runners from the east sent word to the Kumeyaay people that Spanish explorers were sighted in the desert. A detachment of Coronado's inland expedition would eventually cross through Quetzal territory in Lima. And think of runners as our daily newspaper. So a long time ago, these lands were connected by roads and runners. So news traveled fast, especially of a violent encounter. So before Cabrillo got here, we already knew of the Spanish in the east. As news of Coronado's expedition spread west, there's a shot of Coronado's expedition. As news of Coronado's expedition spread to the west coast, some speculate news of Cabrillo's ship spread eastward to the desert and inspired the author of this petroglyph. So right here is this is a replica at the Maritime Museum. And here is a photo of the actual petroglyph in East County. So interestingly, hold on, let me take a throat lozenge. So I actually taught 3 classes before this. Crazy, right? Like a lecturing machine over here.
This university will run into the ground.
Yeah, I'm learning that, right? Yeah, we should be getting overtime like the police or something, right? All right. Sorry for licking my fingers. All right. So petroglyphs. Petroglyphs are found in caves and on large boulders throughout San Diego County and Baja, Mexico, that depict geographic patterns, diverse ancient symbols, significant constellations, and our ancestors' worldview. Some scholars speculate a petroglyph of a ship is in East County. And this, if it's true, would be the oldest geographical representation of a recorded event in US history, if it's true. On this next slide, I want to share with you our soon-to-be released graphic novel, our past, present, and future, as well as beyond gaming. I worked on this project for 4 years with Mike Connoly, the speaker after me. He's from Campo. Where's Mike? Is Mike here? Oh, I didn't see you. Hey, Johnny, I'm pretty good. With Stanley Rodriguez from San Isabel, as well as Lorena Roscoe from San Pasqual. Now here is a part of our script. And the Cabrillo's ship, the San Salvador, is featured prominently in our graphic novel and represents first contact for all California natives. So right here we have on the front cover, this is Cabrillo's ship, the San Salvador. And look, there's me and Mike. Look pretty good, right? Yeah. And then, all right, but it's, oh yeah, then here we have our second. So on the cover, we have Cabrillo's ship. And on the opening first page, we have a depiction of the rock art. And this is an actual joke that my daughter came up with. That I remember I was showing her the this last picture. True story. And I asked her what that looks like, and she said it looks like a Subway sandwich. So I'm like, that has to make it its way into our comedy. And it did. Right? Pretty cool, right? So there she is on her phone like she always is. Even if I take it away, it finds her way into her hand. And she's saying that joke. So super happy about that. Good job, Kylie. It is important to highlight we are a very diverse bunch. And our opinions vary. That's important to highlight that. However, most California natives view this moment of first contact, September 28, 1542, as a day of mourning and lamentation and not a day of celebration in general. In 2010, we protested the building of a replica ship of first contact, Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo. I want to direct your eyes to that blue circle. So this is a first draft, and I don't think I'm supposed to show you this. So don't tell anybody. I was told these drafts aren't for anyone else's eyes. But what I just said actually makes its way onto this our comic. And this is page 16. So this is our kind of resistance movements throughout the ages, as well as we highlight my father. So my father is honored on this page for his participation in the occupation of Alcatraz in 1969. My dad was there, which was the beginning of the Red Power movement. So what we're highlighting here is all those moments in time where Kumeyaay people were part of resistance movements. So I can go on, but it's pretty cool that we were part of these greater movements. This was followed, against the wishes of many California Indians, the $6.5 million replica was completed in 2015. And this was followed by an effort to make San Salvador the official state ship of California to accompany other symbols like the California quail and the California poppy. There's another shot. All right. So what I'm asking for in this new chapter of American history is every part of our society needs representation. It is a vital imperative to include the voice of indigenous peoples of San Diego, California, the United States, as well as the rest of the indigenous people of the world. Now is the time to tell our shared history from a more modern and less biased point of view. Now is the time to celebrate history from all perspectives. Please use the QR code for more information on our graphic novel. Be on the lookout November 15th for a free digital copy or a hard copy for $1,000. Thank you for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Ethan. Thank you. We're gonna have questions, I'm sure.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you, Ethan, for the great effort of already having three lectures today and getting here at the end of the day. We are definitely exploiting you at this moment.
Use me, man, use me.
But I will say that it was always the goal of the organization of this conference to precisely that. This, as I said before, this polyedric perspective, because it doesn't make sense
to just be talking about specifically the Portuguese in Panama, or being taken out of Africa and then ending up in the Moluccas. We need to talk about indigenous populations too, to have a better awareness of even that reality, right? You cannot understand even the Portuguese navigation without understanding the actual indigenous populations with whom the Portuguese or the Spaniards were in touch with. So with that, I want to open for questions, and I think there's a question, and I'm not going to control. I'll control the format, but not the content.
I just want to mention to the speaker that several previous speakers actually are in sync with you on some things. Professor João Paulo Oliveira Costa, who spoke here from the University of Lisbon, he talked about the fact that when that Europeans talk about discovering other lands and other people, when in fact people were discovering each other. The discovery occurred on both sides. Also, Professor Andrés Reséndez sitting here, he has written a book about a Spaniard by the name of Cabeza de Vaca, who was landed and isolated from all the rest of his expedition in Florida. Took 8 years to come across. I think they started with 300 people, ended up with four people at the end. And he came to know the humanity of the Indians. He saw them differently than the Spaniards had seen them. And he tried like hell to spread the word to Spain and to ally with these people rather than try to conquer and enslave them. So there are people here who understand what you're talking about and spoken about it, and wrote about it, written about it.
Questions, comments?
Banegas, if you please. A few moments ago, you showed the name that the Kumeyaay used to give to San Diego. It was what was the name again?
For San Diego?
Yeah, there was a slide where you showed, this was the name that in Kumeyaay, Coma something?
Well, so Castoy was a village site.
You said San Diego was the San Miguel by Cabrillo. There's a slide where we have the word.
That's probably Iris's book, right? Is that what you're talking about?
Sure. Well, my question is there any place like that in
Is this the one?
yeah, Guacamal, there you go. San Diego was called Guacamal by the natives. Was that first name? Not even San Miguel by Cabrillo? On the right side, it says
Might
Guacamal.
be the one to ask on that.
No, they called the Spanish guacamole.
Guacamole,
Oh,
right?
I think it, guacamole.
Oh, I see, got it. So the natives are calling the Spanish.
I think it had, I think it was a like stranger,
That's the meaning of the.
Yeah, I actually never heard that before.
Okay, I was just.
Yeah, and like I said, she taught me a lot.
Okay.
It took around a dozen, maybe 10 classes.
Understood. Thank you. It was quick, I didn't. Yeah,
That's a great point. Yeah.
Questions, comments?
I haven't been very involved in the Portuguese community with respect to the Cabrillo. But one of the things that I have noticed was that in the celebration of Cabrillo's and reenactment of Cabrillo's stepping foot jump, is that the Kumeyaay are always invited and participate, as well as, the Mexican and, sorry, I apologize, Spanish. So everybody, they try to get everybody there.
Yeah.
And I think that each one of those cultures, at least from my perspective, have always been portrayed in a positive light. So I know that they don't go too much into, they have a short narrative, but I just wanted to make that point that at least from our perspective, it was kind of a enlightenment and showing how, like you had mentioned, Cabrillo didn't want to have these people shot and whatnot, as often did. So
Yeah.
I understand.
Yeah, I think just a lot of it is like the amount of history versus other histories.
Mhm.
If we're gonna do quantity, why is not even quality, just quantity? There's an overwhelming amount, and I'm sure Mike's gonna talk about this in his lecture. There's an overwhelming amount of Spanish and pure Spanish history, right? At the expense of Mexican Indian history, Mexican and Indian history. So We have this, so I actually started this lecture during the summer of 2022, where we're talking about removing the Cabrillo statue.
Right.
So that's, Bill asked me to give a lecture at the History Center. And, after George Floyd was murdered and we started toppling all those Confederate statues, it's that same group. So I think the question is, what do we do to correct things? And I would say the best way forward isn't to erase anybody's history, but it's just to put it in the right order and the right amount. Our people have been here for 13,000 years, and colonization is just the tip of the spear. So why are we focusing on just that part and not these other parts? So I think for me, it's just as far as a historian,
Right.
that's all I'm saying.
But who's to blame for that?
Not us.
Because, and the reason, not you because you were here, but what I'm saying is each one of us has a responsibility to tell the story. And if we don't tell the story, it will be forgotten. And that's, we're running into that even with our own Portuguese community, because if you really, besides Cabrillo, there's a very vibrant Portuguese community in Paloma, but you can't find books about it. I'm sure that most of your students didn't know that San Diego was the tuna capital of the world 30 years ago, right? You don't see a tuna boat. But if we don't tell that story that we were here, and I'm not just saying we Portuguese, but that industry was here, nobody's gonna know. So it's not, it is people like yourself who can bring this awareness and tell the story and make sure that it gets told.
Right.
So that's-
And I would say, you invite people. You invite people to colloquia, you invite people so that you have as diverse events as you can. In fact, the 2 talks ago, Andrés was talking about an Afro-Portuguese pilot in a Spanish ship, which may seem strange. We're talking about 16th century, but he was a former enslaved person, freed, that was piloting a ship. And tomorrow we'll actually be talking about woman admiral in one of the Spanish ships as well, of Portuguese heritage. And yes, and that is the thread that connects, but you need to basically know your times and know what time we are living in right now, and be sure to, as Ethan was saying, it's not so much whether you're trying to silence or not, it's whether you're trying to invite people to even come and tell their story, and that's what we also want to do. So thank you. I think there was one last question, and then we have to move on to Michael, because I don't want to delay us too much. I think we are on.
I'm not exactly a historian, but I do some kind of cultural history. And there are, scholars here that can talk with Marcel about this. But for me, without a moral position, there is no history. Can be implicit, but you have to take a stand morally in relation. There is not objective, it's impossible. We are living in a planet where conflicts were, constant, So that's very important. For me, colonization is the history where violence has to be a word that has to be first, Without colonization, probably the key word is violence, Against cultures, bodies, animals, plants. And another brief thing about the tuna. In the 2024, the history of fishing and what is, industrial fishing and the history of the oceans is very different how it was, 50 years ago. Now we have atlas in the oceans. I'm more familiar with Atlantic, but cod fishing in Canada destroyed the oceans. So, and I put just an example of how history has to be told from the year, the moment we are living, and talking about colonialism and violence, and talking about, for example, fishing. And fishing is complicated because it was also a way of life, and but the idea that fishing is certain kind of fishing industrial is destroying bottom of the ocean, and it's also important at this part, you know, if we want to keep the ocean here for future generations.
So they brought tuna and jujitsu to San Diego, right? Yeah.
Well, presumably it's about jiu-jitsu.
No, my sister married into a Portuguese family and they have a dojo. Connected that way, you know?
Any other, we actually still have a couple of minutes. Any other questions or comments? If not, I will take, oh, there was a question.
Yeah, yes.
I was gonna say like what, do, you know, does the Korean nation have any, plans for Cabrillo or like, do they have any kind of like, interventions planned for that area?
Well, I think what we're in talks with is replacing the statue with a Kumeyaay statue. They didn't call me back, so we'll see. They were supposed to hit us up, maybe they're busy, but I think there's consensus that that's the right thing to do, even amongst the Spanish community. Iris, who is totally part of that community, you probably, I'm sure you know her, right? Was okay with that. I think for the most part, that's what we would like, is this statue to be removed.
Not gonna happen. Not gonna happen.
And a Kumeyaay statue to be placed there, right?
Well, but then if you're talking and to be integral, then you can't just have the Kumeyaay. I respect the Kumeyaay were here, but then you have the Spanish, you have the, no? Sorry?
They are here.
Right,
Yeah.
okay, but you know,
They're
it's
coming
kind of,
together, they're coming
yeah,
together.
it's the coming together of that. You know, I would have no objection to a Kumeyaay statue.
Yeah.
Doing away with this one.
I think there's also another comment there or a question and
Yeah, so just a comment, and just to contextualize it, I previously served on the Chula Vista, City of Chula Vista Commission for the removal of the Columbus statue. And part of our conversations there, and this was a result of Kumeyaay and other indigenous folks who also pushed to remove that statue, that oftentimes these debates get kind of argued along the lines of like, well, you're also embracing history to remove such a statue. But part of what our conversation, ultimately, what we recommended for the Chula Vista City Council, is that it's not about an erasure of history, but rather a correction of history that is then accompanied with a plaque that speaks to the fact that there had been a Cabrillo, or in that case, Columbus statue, and why the process of removing it. So it's not about removing it and erasing it completely, but an accompanying narrative about the process itself and why people have felt compelled to make these types of changes or adaptations to what has been in that space. So I mean, as folks move forward with this process, if that's the direction it's going, I would encourage that the Portuguese community or Spanish community not be, you know, as respond in a way like you're erasing us, but rather take the approach of how can we honor Kumeyaay and write a broader narrative that accounts for all.
And if I may, continuing on you, I'm sorry for taking the stage. Cabrillo carrying his ships with the forced labor of the Lenca from El Salvador that speak the Poton language, they also deserve a statue. The black slaves who were working forcefully to build those ships, they also deserve a statue. What the sea separated and these people united, it was not just Cabrillo. So I'm more a believer on adding versus subtracting.
Right.
So I would agree on having the Poton, the Lenca from El Salvador, and the black slaves who work on those ships, and the Kumeyaay who live here. I think that makes sense because all of them were part of it, and not just Cabrillo alone. Subtracting, I don't think that's beneficial for anyone, but there's some missing there, right?
there's discussion to be made for sure.
Just one brief comment. I like the.
If you don't mind,
the-
I haven't made a comment yet. Do you think I could speak?
So that someone is asking if they can speak because they haven't had a chance. Go ahead, please.
Please go ahead.
Thank you. You know, Fremont apparently killed 300 New York people up north, and I had felt like we should take his name off the state. But I don't see that with Cabrillo because he didn't kill people here in San Diego, and he actually was kind of known for being a less violent pirate. you know, Columbus also, I see that because Columbus had a history in the Caribbean with the native people is pretty horrific. You know, but the fact that Cabrillo came here, he didn't even bring disease, you know, because he had that kind of trading relationship that was not going to cause disease. See why taking down Cabrillo honors the Kumeyaay. To me, honoring the Kumeyaay is really important. And I don't see that taking that down would solve that.
Sure.
I think we should take two more comments and then move to the next speaker. So Joe and then a student. Joe was asking to talk, so I think we should still talk.
Okay, I just want to make a brief comment. We've moved from the study of facts to opinions. And I also want to voice my opinion about this. And that is, I think the model of discovery that Professor Oliveira Costa put forth, that it was a mutual discovery, is the way to go here, because that's what happened in San Diego. It wasn't one or the other. It was a mutual discovery. As you mentioned, the petroglyphs of a caravel. So they were discovering something new. It was two societies looking at each other anew and not exactly understanding each other. So I'm for both. I'm for real national monument.
So I do interrupt. There's a student, there's another person here, and we're going to wrap up, okay? Unless someone really wants to intervene. I'm not going to shut up anyone, but we do want to move to the next speaker. Also, to talk about not a similar topic, but a topic that is close to this. Please.
So I'm actually one of Mr. Banegas' students. I'm a freshman. I've only been here for 5 weeks, but I've learned more than I ever thought I would from him. I'm in your American Indian history studies, right? And I think I've always been passionate about this kind of stuff, and when it comes to activism and history, because I'm a very big history nerd, but I love studying all types of history, and especially this kind. On the Republican side, and because I've been alive to see the big shifts that are going on right now, the main question that I've seen circulating, and the one that I feel the most important to ask is as it stated, why is this history celebrated? Because when you look at the actual actions of these people overall, like Cabrillo, even though, yeah, he traded here and he did spread disease. European context spreads disease no matter what. The main reason for
That's true. They spread disease when people come off the boat and establish themselves. Like there was trade apparently by the Bosses in Canada for hundreds of years, and it wasn't until they got off that Plymouth plantation that
there was disease spread in Canada too. But I mean, you know what trade is, right? No matter what, the main reason for the spread of disease in New England, I learned this today, thank you, was because of fishermen. Dutch fishermen spread disease. That was 100 years before the English arrived on the Mayflower. I digress. When you look at the people who are put up, the people who are venerated, their values traditionally align with exploitation, conquest, plundering, enslavement, and genocide. Which is why for the past 600 years, the actual history of the Kumeyaay people and the indigenous people across the entirety of North and South America has been viciously underrepresented. And for the first time, we have the indigenous people of mainly the United States. It's been different in different parts of the Americas, but in the United States, indigenous people have had the platform to communicate their perspective. And now, as you've taught me, we're beginning to understand history from a multitude of perspectives and questioning our own narratives. Yes, Cabrillo was the first European to land in San Diego Bay. I don't think that's disputed. But he was there in the search of resources. He was there in the search of more riches for the Spanish crown. And the conquistadors he was a conquistador, and the ones that arrived afterwards made their intentions much more clear. I think the fact that he was there for 7 days and then left, broke his arm, and died, I think that's not necessarily worth honoring with a statue. That's just my opinion.
He mapped the world, it's
Just
a fact of history, just a fact of history.
I do wanna pass this you all. Actually, let me just say something for full disclosure. Philippe Cabrillo is a consul of Portugal in San Diego. I think everyone should understand that.
No, I wanted to thank you, it was a very interesting presentation. I think that the two questions here are really important, and I think that once Europeans arrived, I think that the history of California became a shared history. I think that San Diego was made by people coming from everywhere. I think that there's a multitude, there's a diverse society here that enriches actually the city and enriches California. So there's a lot of ways to look at it. And one for sure is that he was a conquistador, there's no question about it, that he was looking for resources, no question about it, but there's also the encounter, there's also the encounter of civilization, and there's also the discovery of the new maritime routes. And that as well, that was advances in oceanography, that was advances in nautical technology. So all that should also be highlighted. So in the meaning that we should, of course, understand and also emphasize the importance of young people and have it some way enshrined in Connoly, for sure. But we should not erase the part of history in order to make the other one.
I mean, if you go to this museum though, we're barely even there. Right?
That's something that should be corrected, should be worked on. But one thing should not be to erase the other. They are complementary.
I completely agree.
And we should not, here the problem is that we should not run the risk of falling into the relativism. So I think as the person mentioned about the moral, look at history from a moral standpoint, it's important that we cannot judge totally all the actions that were made by 16th century men by 21st century standards. So that's also important. Yeah. Thank you very much.
So actually, I'm going to reverse this. Instead of me deciding that we're okay with that with the conversation, I want to ask you, is this a good time to stop and pass the word to the next person? Or what do you think?
I mean, Mike's next.
Well, there's also that part. We do have people waiting.
Yeah, I'm good. I'll be here afterwards for a little bit. But yeah, I'm okay. I'm good, right?
I don't want to put the burden of it on you, but I also don't want to shut up.
We could both be available for comments. If somebody wants to direct a comment to you after me.
Yeah, Mike's actually been, so he's been there way longer than me. He's the man.
Well, I'm going to appreciate Michael's talk, and I really appreciate what you did already. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Raul.
So yes, actually here. So, speaker, to wrap up our day, and we are very excited to have here with us. I would encourage everyone to take a seat or get ready for the next presentation, which we are eager to hear. Michael Connoly Miskwish is a member of the Campo Kumeyaay Nation. In 1990, he helped establish and directed one of the first tribal environmental protection agencies in the United States. Michael researched and implemented traditional environmental practices in contemporary land and resource management. He worked on environmental policy for the National Congress of American Indians, National Tribal Environmental Council, the Good Neighbor Environmental Board, and several US EPA advisory committees. His work on issues of taxation policy and impediments to sustainable tribal economies is nationally recognized. He has authored many papers on tribal economics, Kumeyaay history, and resource management. He has 3 published books on Kumeyaay history and cosmology. He has curated exhibits on Kumeyaay culture and history for the National Museum of Art, National Museum of the American Indian in Washington,
Technologies, and the Museum of Men in San Diego, California. In 2006, he was a recipient of the John Montgomery Education Award by the Congress of History of San Diego and Imperial Counties. And in 2017, he was inducted into the Kumeyaay Kuseyay Association. Michael's formal education includes a Bachelor of Science in Manufacturing Engineering, Master of Arts in Economics, an MA in Anthropology. He's currently a PhD student at UCSD in Sociocultural Anthropology. He is an adjunct faculty in American Indian Studies at San Diego State University, so thank you also for joining us. I'm from the Department of Indian Studies. He served 17 years in elected office for the Campo Kumeyaay Nation. He currently consults with tribal governments and governmental agencies on topics of economics, resource management, taxation, and education. He works directly with the Kumeyaay, the Ageno Land Conservancy. I do not read, but it's been a long day. And Kumeyaay Community College. He continues to write and lecture on Kumeyaay history and culture. But thank you, Michael, for accepting. I know you're in a really busy schedule, so that's another reason to thank you. Thank you.
I thought you Mendiwe, which he, Michael Connoly, Miskwish, and Yakupai, Nishkatai. My name is Michael Connoly. I'm from the Miskwish clan of the Campo Band of the Kumeyaay Nation. I'm gonna, with the short time that we have, and being at the end of the day too, this is, well, it's not quite as bad as being right after lunch, but.
We're okay.
Are we? Okay. I'm gonna talk to you about the history of history. And it overlaps a lot with what Ethan was talking about. I kind of wanted to raise my hand a couple times when people were talking. I have my own opinions on a few of those things, but I didn't want to delay my own self in getting up here to talk, so I didn't do that. So, you know, Ethan talked a little bit about who we are. You know, the Kumeyaay people were, you know, one of many of the different, these are the language families in California. One of the most densely populated areas in the world, the highest concentration of ethnic groups and languages. The only place that really exceeds it is Papua New Guinea. So just a tremendous amount of variation that you have in here. So it's really interesting that here in the state of California, when you talk about history, or when you look at the formal history that's taught in the schools, there's this story that's told that's kind of a monograph that applies over the whole state, when really there are just literally hundreds of individual stories and different ways that people dealt not only with each other, not only with the environment, but also with the different waves of encroachment that came in. And you've seen that already. So the California story. So here we have this great story that was created in the 20th century. The romantic dream of caballeros, hidalgos, beautiful young ladies, the fatherly friars and submissive Indians. One of the comments was about, that I heard earlier, was about the ceremony of Cabrillo coming ashore. And I don't know how it's done now, but I remember when I was younger, you know, Cabrillo would come ashore, he would step on the shore, plant the flag and claim it for Spain, and the Indians would all drop to one knee and they and that was the reenactment, you know, and I you know, who was, you know, what do I know about it, you know? And later on I found out, hey, they don't even have a record of whether he even did that ceremony. So, and nobody recorded that all the Indians dropped to one knee and took a prayer. They didn't even know Christianity either, but they all happened to put their hands together and so I don't know, you know, hopefully it's a little better now. Father Sarah, you know, coming in, love, peace, and harmony, and these missions were built one day apart, connected by the El Camino Real, and the Indians were uplifted. They were brought into this progression from paganism to neophyte, becoming a contributing member of Spanish society. And eventually these ranchos gave way. These ranchos were part of the civilizing that occurred in California, eventually setting the stage for the entry of the United States. So this is kind of the story, and it's still taught quite a bit in California. We're making a little bit of inroads into into that story, and different native people in different areas have their own versions, their own facts that they want to bring forward. And so it varies, even within our own communities. We have several different stories of the relationship between the Spanish and the Kumeyaay. They weren't all the same at all. So this has been put into artwork, into pictures, into statues, of course. It was interesting to hear the discussion on the Cabrillo statue. I don't know if it was mentioned before, but originally they had proposed a Cabrillo statue that would be equal in size to the Statue of Liberty. And and eventually this more diminutive guy found his way. He actually didn't come here. I think went to San Francisco and then eventually found his way down here. So that's a whole nother story there. Really, hits the highlights in the Rose Bowl floats of the mission play, and the mission play was a common thing up in Los Angeles. There again, taking this whole idea of the priests and the Indians coming in, and of course, if you look at their attire, a lot of it is Plains Indian stuff that people incorporated into the Indians. This is recently from Amazon, and they have a kit for every single mission in California, $29.99, and that way you can do your 4th grade project and get an A on it. So where did this start? Where did this story of California start? Did it really come? Is this our legacy that came from the Spanish and the Mexicans that really was incorporated into California? Where did this happen? And it started actually with the railroads, real estate speculators, and civic boosters. It was a branding of California that occurred in the late 1800s, and it started around 1880. Went up to 1930 and really reached its zenith in the 1960s. And that was really, and as Ethan said, the Red Power movement in the late 60s, really started bringing more dialogue in, and that, hey, there's another way to look at some of these things that you have just been taken for granted as being a fact. When California became a state, it said it would not tolerate slavery, but then they created these laws regarding vagrancy and indenture that essentially made slaves out of Indians. Eventually they expanded that with the Greaser Act, so that they included Mexicans as well. Not only Mexicans, there were also a lot of Chileans that had come up into California for the gold rush, and so they also got caught into that Greaser Act. While this was going on in the state, and while programs of extermination were going on, especially in Northern California, whole communities were being obliterated. Women and children were being captured and sold into indenture, which was slavery, sometimes into brothels, sometimes into individual homes to work as servants. No protections at all. In fact, it was illegal for an Indian to testify against a white person. So if a crime was committed, you had to get another white person to testify against the first white person in order to get any kind of justice. So while this was going on in the state and under state law, under the federal system, they were coming and negotiating treaties with the tribes. So our treaty was negotiated in 1852. We chose to identify ourselves collectively as the Degano Nation. And Degano was a term that Father Sarah used for the Indians at the mission in San Diego. It didn't really apply just to the Ipai Tipai speaking people, but any Indians who were living in the mission they were considered Degano. So it was kind of a misnomer, but it was adopted. It showed the understanding that we had of ourselves as one people. We didn't have to do it when the treaties were negotiated. In many parts of the state, people you'll see, 15, 16 different identifications for different groups that wanted to be identified separately. But in our particular case, everybody came together and said, yes, we are one people. The treaty guaranteed about 20% of present San Diego County as reservation land. Well, as you know, if you look at a map or you drive into East County, 20% of San Diego is not reservation land. The treaty was voted down in Senate committee. The Indians weren't told that had happened. the state programs continued to force Indians into indenturehood, attack them. Indians died from the conditions. They were forced to relocate. If they had, there were a lot of Indians that knew ranching. They had worked under the Mexican or even under the Spanish system as vaqueros. They had generations of experience, and so they started ranches. They thought they had a treaty. They thought they had ranches. They weren't told the treaties weren't ratified. And then a white person would come in, file a homestead on it, and would have a ready-made ranch and kick the Indians out. So they ended up getting relocated, getting displaced over and over again. We had communities within the existing city of San Diego that existed up into the 20th century. So where people were providing labor in the cities. A lot of the labor in the shipping industry, in the whaling industry, came from the Indians. Indians were the majority of the dock workers in San Diego. Indians were the crews. Indians and Hawaiian natives were some of the predominant crews on a lot of the ships. There's a story about one whaling ship where the owner of the ship fired all his white crewmen and hired all Indians because he said the white people were too much drunk. They were too much drunks. They just weren't showing up for work, and they were just getting drunk all the time. So he brought Indians in because they were better workers. So this is, you know, there's a mix of stuff that was going in that maybe you never heard about. Gives you a different perception of, or a different perspective on the people that were existing there at the time. So what brought this about? Why did we have this recreation of history? Well, it goes back to the Transcontinental Railroad, and the biggest crony capitalist project that you had at that time. Normally railroads would go from population center to population center. Never had there been a railroad that went all the way from St. Louis to California, with only Salt Lake City as the only real beneficiary. There weren't towns in between. How could you have a railroad like that? They paid the railroad by the mile. So one ingenious thing that happened was the designers of the rail intentionally curved the track in a lot of areas so they get more miles on it and get more subsidies off the federal government. So it's really interesting. So they got this, and people didn't need it. People in California said, well, you know, we don't really need this railroad because we're shipping through Panama. You know, they'd ship it down to Panama, they'd take the rail there to across the other side of the isthmus, and then they'd ship it up to the East Coast. And they didn't really need an overland route all the way from California. But the United States, they wanted it, and they had all, you know, there was a lot of political reasons for wanting to do that, and also to unite the country politically. So it was completed in 1869. One of the main ways they made money on the railroad was through passenger traffic. So it wasn't as freight oriented as it is now. So they needed people to use the railroad. But people at that time, you know, this in the 1880s, you know, people grown up on dime novels, and the West was this wild place. There was savage Indians. There were all these wild animals, grizzly bears and mountain lions, and all these things that were going to jump out and kill you, and banditos everywhere. You know, they did not. The West was a scary place to go. So they needed a way to convince people that this is not the Wild West. And so one of the things that they did was there was a book called Ramona that was written by Helen Hunt Jackson. Now, Helen Hunt Jackson, she wrote a book called The Century of Dishonor, which was a very good accounting of all of the horrific things that were occurring in Indian country. She was commissioned to do it after the attack on Custer at Little Bighorn and his death. And you know, that happened in 1876. So the United States was 100 years old. They were celebrating their centennial, and here these primitive Stone Age people went and wiped out a unit of the United States military. You know, one of the strongest militaries in the Americas. You know, how can that possibly have happened? And it shocked people. And so they said, we need to find out what's really going on. And so she was commissioned to go out and survey and find out what was really going on. And she went out and recorded, all kinds of horrific things all throughout the United States. She was especially struck by what was going on with the Indians in California, and especially Southern California. And she spent some time in Southern California, and she decided she was going to write a book. She wanted to humanize the Indians. So she wanted to write something like Uncle Tom's Cabin that would apply to Indians and would make people feel more compassionate toward the plight of the Indians who were being dispossessed of their lands. So she wrote Ramona, and it didn't succeed in what she wanted. Instead, people read it and they saw this, she was trying to make a comparison between the Mexican period and the coming of the Americans and how brutal the Americans were. And so she, in doing that, it ended up creating this image of the Mexican period as having been so much better for the Indian people, the idyllic kind of period. And that captured people's imagination. They said, wow, that's wonderful. And so it became a bestseller. In fact, they're even into the 21st century, there are telenovelas in Spanish of Ramona. It's a story that never stops. I think one of the first movies, Mary Pickford starred as Ramona in one of the first movies in the 1904 or something. It was right at the very earliest part of the 20th century. So this story has really gone on. So here's these Americans that are fascinated with this story, Ramona. And what happened is they came out to California and they looked around and said, where are these missions? Where are these ranchos? They weren't here. They had crumbled to ruin. The Indian people had defeated the missions. They had outlasted them. The mission San Diego was a barracks in the Civil War for the U.S. Army. The only ones that were surviving were essentially parish churches. But as an organization, the colonial mission system was long gone. And so, but people wanted to see it. And so these civic leaders, the boosters, the railroads, they said, hey, people want to see this stuff. Let's give it to them. And so they started pouring thousands of dollars into rebuilding the missions. So all of the missions in California were rebuilt, and they didn't have blueprints for them either. So they had to figure out, how are we gonna build these missions? And so they ended up, I'll come back to this. So they ended up having to create the architecture that was going to make it. So mission revival architecture started in 1890. It didn't start in 1769 when the mission was built. It was 1890. The colonial revival style architecture, 1915. That was the San Diego Panama Exposition. And so these styles are not a legacy that was handed down to us. And in fact, a lot of what you see in the Spanish revival architecture actually started finding its way into Mexican architecture and even into Spain. So it's actually going the other way. It was not something that came over to us.
Can I just say the world exhibit in Sevilla was the style.
Yeah.
Some of the edifices were based off the Pan American exhibit here in 1915. So it was a complete reversal. You are absolutely right. Thank you.
So they were trying to reconnect to the past. They wanted to make California civilized. They wanted to separate California from the West. And so now when we talk about the West, that's Arizona, Nevada, New Mexico. It's not California. California is the Pacific, or California is just California. So that's where California no longer was the West. Was when they redefined it here as part of this marketing tool to get people to come out. They wanted white people to come out. There were too many Latinos in California. There were too many, well, the Indians, they took care of that, but when California first became a state, half the population was Indian. And they had pretty much been eliminated as a sizable part of the population by 1900. But there were still a lot of Latinos. They wanted white people in. And when I say white, what the term white has morphed over time. Back then, there were many people who didn't consider any Mediterranean people as white. Portuguese, Spanish, Italians, or Greek, you weren't white. But there are some that would normally say, well, you can be fringe white. And even Irish, which some of the palest people on earth weren't considered white in a lot of areas. I don't know how California, I don't think they were really discriminated too bad in California. But other parts of the country they were. So they wanted white people from the East Coast to migrate into California. They had to create this atmosphere for them where they were coming into a civilization. So even though they looked down their nose at the Spanish and Portuguese in their contemporary view, they saw it as a good way. They could be the springboard for American civilization. We'll say, yeah, these Europeans came in. They're not as elevated as we are, but they did set the stage for us. They did help civilize the area so that we could then come in and make it even better. And so that became the history that was brought in. The rediscovery of Cabrillo's landing site was part of that effort. That, you know, all of these things were starting to happen where they were trying to find out more information about the Spanish past, the Portuguese past, and so in 1892 they had the Cabrillo Festival. And it's interesting when you look at the pictures, there were a lot of Kumeyaay that were there. There were Luiseños that were there. They brought in local Indian tribes to be a part of the Cabrillo celebration. But almost immediately it started morphing into something else. 1904, one of the last, there were 4 families that were kicked out of Coronado Island. There were still villages all around Florida Canyon and Mission Valley. There were still a lot of South Bay. There were still a lot of Indian villages in the urban areas. They kept a low profile. They kept themselves pretty scattered because they didn't want to be attacked. But by 1911, it almost became a caricature where they had a festival. The Cabrillo Festival was ruled over by King Cabrillo and Queen Ramona. Then 1915, the San Diego Panama Exposition came in. So then they renamed City Park into Balboa Park to honor Balboa for crossing the Panama Isthmus. And there was a thriving village in Florida Canyon in Balboa Park, and they looked at this village and they said, you know, we're going to be bringing people in from all over the world, and that's not the kind of Indians that they're going to be expecting to look at. And so they kicked the Indians out of Balboa Park, and the Santa Fe Railroad went to New Mexico and brought over almost the entire San Ildefonso Pueblo. And where the parking lot is for the San Diego Zoo, they built a pueblo, and so that they could be the Indians that the tourists saw when they came in there. So the real residents of Balboa Park, the Kumeyaay, were kicked out at that point. Names were changed during this transition time. When the Americans came in, they were using English spelling on a lot of the places. A lot of Indian names for places had English spelling. Hamul, if you look at old records, you know, was Hamul. So as part of this Hispanishization, they changed it, and so they spelled it with a J, or they translated it. Milshkatai means the big meadow in Kumeyaay. So the Americans couldn't pronounce Milshkatai, so they called it Milgwatai. So in the old records, you see that. Then around the late 1880s, early 1900s, then they just translated the name into the Spanish word campo, and that became the name for our area. Utai became Otai, Pauwe became Pauwe. So all of these different names, native names, got Spanishized. They also named. There was a lot of naming of other places that was Spanish. So they new developments that occurred in San Diego, roads that they were building in San Diego. A lot of them were getting Spanish names. Not just in San Diego, but all the way up in California as a part of this this process. So the majority of the Spanish names you see on things in California were by Anglo-Americans. They were not named by the Spanish and then that name carried forward into the present day. The story of the El Camino Real. So, you know, that these missions were built one day apart, north to south, and then there was this highway, the El Camino Real. Well, there was no El Camino Real. But, you know, some people say, well, technically, any road that the Spanish crown used wasn't El Camino Real. And so, you know, I said, well, if that's your definition, then you just need to shade in the map because you can't draw the line because there were roads all over the place. And so,
Especially Spain.
So it's great. There were real El Camino Reals in New Spain, but there wasn't one in California. And what it was an invention of the Auto Club of Southern California and some other organizations in the early 20th century. So they wanted to, another part of this Spanishization of California, they wanted to create the El Camino Real. They got legislation passed in the legislature to designate Highway 1 as the El Camino Real. And they incorporated the mission bell into their logo. So who gets something out of this? Well, Spain had a very nasty war with the United States, right at the turn of the 20th century. This was an opportunity for them to establish a presence, to actually sell themselves as being a part of the creation of the United States. You know, yeah, you defeated us in the war, but really you didn't defeat us because you're part of us too. So, you know, it was a consolation prize, I think, to them to have that presence, have that role in the creation of California and in the United States. For the Catholic Church, this was it was something that helped them in having a greater role. In the United States, there was a lot of anti-Catholicism at the time, and so here was a way to say, oh, the Catholic Church was another contributing member to the creation of California, and so, you know, we should be honored and respected for that role that we played. The real estate speculators, some of them were just outrageous in the amounts of lands that they carved up. Some of the biggest ones ended up going bankrupt though, because people didn't come exactly when they wanted them to. They came, but it was a little too late. The railroads, it worked for the railroads. They got passenger traffic to come in. It wasn't enough. The Union Pacific, I think, ended up going into bankruptcy protection for a couple years because the initial surge wasn't enough for them, but then later on it picked up. And the boosters, one of the if you're familiar at all with San Diego history, one of the big boosters of San Diego was a guy named Charles Loomis. And Charles Loomis was the founder of the Sequoia League, which did a lot of work for tribes. He inserted himself into the relocation of the Kupa people to the Paulo Basin, which they characterize as their Trail of Tears, where they were dislocated from the lands that had always been part of their heritage. He considered himself a do-gooder. He thought he was doing them a favor that anybody else would have done worse. He also helped to get legislation passed that expanded the Campo Reservation, because even up into the 20th century, there were still a lot of Indian people who didn't have a reservation, who were still living just basically squatting out in federal land, squatting in urban areas. So there were these little communities all over the place. So there was a major expansion of Campo Reservation in 1910 that came largely because of his efforts. He saw this whole mission history as a good thing for Indian people. He said, you know, if we can do this, if we can create this, tourists are going to come here. They're going to want to come to see the missions. They're going to want to come to see the ranchos. And when they do, the Indian people can be the actors that are there. So when they come to the mission, the Indians can be there doing crafts or praying or whatever, and that'll be jobs for them. And so he saw this as a good thing that would help not only the economy in California and San Diego, especially San Diego and LA, but also that it would help Indian people here. So what really happened, you know, let's see how much time I got.
About 10 minutes roughly.
You're okay.
So really, you know, what got left out, you know, when history got rewritten and we got put into this, there was so much resistance that occurred against the Spanish missions that came in, and then following that, the Mexicans, and there were a lot of successes. The Quechan people destroyed 2 missions at the Colorado River, preventing an overland route into Upper California. And there was never, even throughout the entire Mexican period, they never were able to reestablish that route into Upper California. So that meant you had to come overland up the peninsula, or you come by boat. Boat was horrible. The Spanish galleons, they're square sailed, and if you know anything at all about sailing, square sails are great for going downwind. They're horrible for trying to tack, and they had to go way, way out at sea in order to just gain a couple miles on the coast. Almost always had scurvy by the time they finally landed, and then the overland route, some pretty harsh desert in Baja California. So really, that restricted more than anything the development of the missions and more settlement into Upper California. You know, one of the things I also heard a comment about Cabrillo, you know, his role or what he did as an individual, and I think he did take a couple kids, but I don't know if they went voluntarily or if they were kidnapped.
It's in the Relación, the report that 2 kids would go on boats.
Yeah,
I don't think it actually says that the kids.
They don't really say if they went willingly or not.
No, I think it's pretty clear that they didn't go willingly, but what it doesn't say is that whether they were taken afterwards or not.
But it was a catalyst for a lot of other things, including eventually the missions, because Cabrillo wanted to determine if there's the gyre in the Pacific, the same as there is in the Atlantic. His expedition continued north after he died, and they did determine that the winds did shift and come from the west. There was another expedition north of Japan that also found the same thing, and so that started the Spanish galleons sailing down off the coast. The Spanish galleons were loaded with wealth. There was always a fear of piracy. There was one galleon that was attacked and taken by, I think, Cavendish was the pirate in the Gulf of California. The
Santana.
So did I get that right?
Santana. Yeah.
So they needed a way, you know, when these guys traveled across the Pacific, it was a lot longer than going across the Atlantic. And by the time they got into California, they were low on water, they were low on food, but they had all this wealth in their ships, and so they were under orders not to put into port anywhere until they got to Acapulco to unload. So in none of the maritime journals do you see any record of them putting in anywhere in California, because it was illegal. But they had to have. I mean, they were out of water. They were out of food. So they were putting in. They were getting supplies. They were doing whatever trade they could to get supplies so that they could continue on down the coast. But there was still a vulnerability. They needed a place where people could put in. Vizcaino was sent to determine where that would be, and he established that Monterey was the location. And then when Father Serra came in after the Jesuits were expelled, and Father Serra proposed putting missions in Alta California, one of the objectives was to get that Monterey port established. They decided that the missions in Baja were too far away from Monterey. They needed something in between, and so that was when they settled on San Diego. So all of these things, they kind of treat one after the other as far as the eventual establishment of the missions. And it was based, you know, once again, just like the history itself, it was based on commercial decisions. California had only a tiny part that was under the missions. And even this is an exaggeration, because when you got between the missions, you had to have armed escort to go between most of the missions, because they were still pretty much under the control of the native people. So most of California throughout the mission system was still under Kumeyaay control. After the destruction of the mission in San Diego in 1775, they rebuilt it a year later. But, and most people see that, you see that in the historical accounts, that the mission was rebuilt a year later. Eventually there were some more Indians that got converted. But what they don't tell you is that the effect of that destruction of the mission was that the Spanish stopped their eastward expansion. So they never went past El Cajon after that because it was just too dangerous. And they did move further inland up in the northern part of San Diego County where the Kumeyaay and the Luiseños had a close relationship, and the Luiseños were more accommodating to them. And eventually they did request a mission up in San Isabel in 1818. The Indians in Baja had a whole different relationship. So, and these, so here's all these different relationships going on. There was a leader called Black Dog, Patnilch, who led most of the people in the northern Kumeyaay territory of Baja. He struck a deal with the Dominicans and he said, hey, I will protect your missions. And all I ask in return, I want to trade with you. I want to have commerce with you. And all I ask is that you don't forcibly convert any of my people. And the Dominicans said, sure, sounds like a bargain to us. So he actually protected them. He eventually had over 1,000 warriors under his command. And he kept the peace with the Spanish, and after that with the Mexicans, all the way up until 1840, when a priest named Felix Cabrillo decided to renege on the agreement, and he started forcibly conscripting people because he needed them to work as laborers in his operations that he had there. He was a pretty wealthy priest, and so then Black Dog marched on the mission Guadalupe. Caballero fled. He actually hid under the skirts of one of the women there, and then and escaped Black Dog. But then he fled to a mission down in Baja. Eventually, assassins found him, and he was poisoned down there. Within a couple of years after that, all of the missions got destroyed in Baja because he would just withdrew his protection. So the mission at Guadalupe, Descanso, La Misión, they all ended up getting destroyed at that time. So even during the Mexican period, when the ranchos were being created, there was still the majority of the state that was under native control. And even in a lot of these missions, or a lot of these ranchos that were created, were pretty much on paper only. They weren't really fully functional. And you can see, so like Cuyamaca and San Isabel and some of these, they really. Some of the ones that did survive were probably paying some kind of concession to the local Kumeyaay to be able to continue to survive. I don't know what the relationship was in the ones further north. These are some of the big battles that occurred. The Jamul in 1837. Actually, the Jamul 1837 battle. After that, there were three leaders, three cachuts. So we chose war leaders. They were called cachuts. The Spanish and the Mexicans called them generals. And there were three cachuts who led an attack on Jamul in 1837. They overran the rancho and they marched on San Diego and laid siege to San Diego. The people of San Diego had to evacuate. They were out on the tip of Point Loma waiting for one of the whaling ships so that they could evacuate while the Kumeyaay laid siege to the Presidio. They got word down into Mexico, and this really brutal Mexican sergeant, Macedonio Gonzalez, he came up, and just his reputation alone was scared people. But so they broke their siege, and then he went after them, and they had I think it was a 4-week chase up through the mountains, zigzagging back and forth in the mountains. They got up to Jacumba, and the Kumeyaay ran into Cocopah and Cochan from the Colorado River, who speak a language very similar to ours. They had heard that San Diego had been taken, so they were coming to loot it. And they found out, oh, that didn't happen, but they joined in with the Kumeyaay and they attacked Gonzalez. He got pinned down there. Then at night, his horses and ammunition got raided, and he barely escaped with his life and got out of there. He had been ordered not to chase after the Kumeyaay, by the way, so for violating orders, he was stripped of his rank and he ended up dying in poverty up in LA. So up into the 20th century, you know, we had all these villages, not just on reservations, but off reservation in a lot of lands, down in San Diego, Mission Valley, Las Choyas, South Bay, all of these different places where there were villages and they would work. A lot of people were laborers in the city, working in the local economy. There were people who were in the mountain areas that were staying pretty independent. Within all of these areas, they were still doing as much of their traditional use of resources as they could. If you ever read the book Delfina Cuero, she talks about the 1920s and 1930s, going down to Mission Bay and going down to Mission Valley and harvesting resources. So they were still going down getting foods, harvesting shellfish on the coast, even though a lot of the permanent villages that they had been pushed inland. You also don't see in this map a lot of the villages that were on ranchos. So a lot of the ranches in the San Diego area had a population of Kumeyaay who lived on the ranch and were doing the work on the ranches, ranch hands. Those disappeared, you know, as the ranchos disappeared and they got broken up or sold off. One of them, though, the Hamul Rancho, the owner signed over the little Indian village there. He signed it over to the Catholic Church to hold in trust for the Indians there. And then in, I think it was the 1970s, they were able to transfer that to the federal government and get recognized as the Hamul Indian Village. And that's why Ethan said they're the smallest reservation in the country. That's why they were just the little village on the Hamul Ranch. The damage of this narrative, and this is my last slide, so thanks for hanging in there with me. The damage of this narrative, you know, sure, you know, it's great for the Spanish, you know, it's great for the railroads, it's great for all these different groups, but they wrote us out of history. We become a backdrop to history. They're not talking about our attack on San Diego. They're not talking about our negotiations with the Dominicans. They're not talking about us sealing off the Colorado River crossing. You know, none of those things in our history get told. Instead, we become a backdrop or a footnote in the history where they say, well, we have to talk about the Kumeyaay because the missionaries had to have somebody to be a missionary too. So the missionaries came in, and then there's the Kumeyaay, and then after that, they just kind of fade out of the discussion. So even when the Bureau of Indian Affairs came in and started their schools on the reservation, they were using the California curriculum to teach the kids. And so when the kids would tell their parents about the history, and the parents would say, no, that's not the history, they'd go back to their teachers, and their teachers would say, no, we have doctorates in history, you know, we have master's degrees in education. We know what we're talking about. Your parents, they're ignorant. They didn't even graduate high school. They don't know what they're talking about. And that was the undermining of the authority of parents between parents and their children was just rampant during this time. It hurts our relationships with other groups too, because there was a lot of interaction between the Kumeyaay. You know, what is a Mexican? You know, what is a Mexican American? You know, we have half our Kumeyaay people are in Mexico, so technically they're Mexicans. You know, how do you define these different things and the relationship that we had with them? A lot of the Mexicans in San Diego were, or the Mexican Americans were mestizos that came up from Mexico, and they intermarried with the Kumeyaay. So a lot of the Kumeyaay then are part of the current Mexican American population. And I run into people all the time in San Diego who say, yeah, we're Kumeyaay, but we never were part of one of the reservations. So they're just one of the families that married in that never did go to that route. Even, you know, causes people to question our identity. When we had human remains that were found at the Chancellor's house in La Jolla, and we tried to reclaim them, they said, well, you guys aren't coastal Indians, you live up there in the mountains. And you know, just so much ignorance that it just gets ingrained and and it becomes an uphill fight just for the tiniest little, you know, recognition of who we are, what our place is in history. And so this then can also feed into these cycles of intergenerational trauma that just get passed on from generation to generation, and where people are disrespectful to their parents, where they feel bad about themselves, where they feel. I remember going to a presentation from a historian in the late '80s, and he was talking about the Kumeyaay, and he really, I think he liked the Kumeyaay. He wanted to show them in a good light, and he said, "Yeah, the Kumeyaay, they're an adaptive people. So wave after wave of invader came in and trampled them into the ground, and they sprang up like reeds." And I said, in my mind, that's a doormat. It's not a positive thing. And I thought, we had to have done more than that. We had to have done more than let people trample over us and then spring back up. And so that's what got me onto researching history and trying to give a real story and telling it not just to non-Indians, but even our own people who don't, who have been, in many cases, have been indoctrinated and 3 or 4 generations into this fictional history that was created for California. So here's some further readings for you if you're interested. California Slave State is a new book that just came out. Really, really interesting. I'd argue with the author a little bit about some of the Kumeyaay stuff they said, but I do that with everybody that writes about Kumeyaay, so I have a different take on some of that, but it was pretty good. I liked it. And Castillo, Across the Thorns. Another one, I think he didn't really talk about the resistance enough, I think, especially in the San Diego area. And Lorimer did a pretty good job of talking about the California mission myths. So anyway, those are 4 recommendations, and that's it. So.
I think your voice really came through. I want to open the session for questions. I think it was a brilliant presentation. I really am thankful for that. But I want to. So I think Paul was first, and then Andrés, and Paulo.
Thank you so much for your lecture. In the previous discussion, we talking about status. Most of statues who exist in the world have 200, most ancients have 200, 300 years. And within 300 years, most of them that exist today, they won't exist. Regimes change, people change, always we keep down the status. And the status are about impressions. Your lecture, you are a statue of knowledge. And that is the point. Because the problem that we have in our society nowadays is that people is concerned about images and not about knowledge. The same people, I'm very sorry that the people that was here, the students, didn't listen to you. Because what you said is so important. Because much more important than to have statues is that to have the programming in the school. It's much more important even for your people. It's much more important than a statue. Of course, a statue is nice. We can do barbecue there and so on. But what is really important is that the new generations are aware of your own history. And that is the most, I can explain that as a historian who deals with European expansion. My training 40 years ago started, I chose to study about Portuguese in Asia. So my first training was to learn Asian history, not Portuguese history. Because I could not, the perspective is I cannot do overseas expansion from the European perspective if I don't understand, which were the dynamics that existed before Europeans arrived anywhere. So that's why I received a condecoration from the Emperor of Japan, not because I spoke about the Portuguese, but because I spoke about the Japanese. And that's a sense. And so I think that you have made an inspiring lecture for me, and that this should be listened by the young people, because young people is more concerned about status and not about knowledge. And this knowledge is a knowledge of an interaction. And also, and let me say frankly, of course, that Cabrillo opened the door. But what you showed to us is what I have also known from South America. the major blame you have is about a government called US government. Because the major massacres of Indian people from Argentina to Canada took place after the independence in the 19th century. And that is history, that's history. And when to my students, I ask them always, which was the Western people who killed more Indians? And they came Spaniards, no. Portuguese, no. They never say the US government. They never say. Disney worked very well. Disney worked. Sorry? No, but it was after the independence. It was after the middle of 19th century. So it happened in a systematic way, as it was explained. As it was explained now, it was as it happened in Ecuador. It happened in Argentina. It happened in Peru. It happened in Brazil. Much more. It was by a reason. Not that US federals are worse than the Portuguese or the Spaniards, but because of industrial revolution, of course. But
I try not to do comparative moralities.
That's not a question of morality. That's not a question of morality. That's a question of perceiving how things evolve.
And when you use the word worse, that they were worse, then you're putting a quantitative value.
I agree with you, but sometimes we have to shock people and we have to show people as you do.
It is a good point, though.
Yes. But thank you so much. Thank you so much.
I understand the numbers.
So I do want to have some order, and Andrés was first, and Paulo, then Marit. This was the order of hands.
There's a gentleman over there as well.
And Roberto, I'm sorry, my eyes, So please, Andrés.
So yeah,
and I will ask for people to be brief.
Yeah, super brief. So first of all, I want to commend you also because beyond what we can say about voyages, etc., you provide a perspective from a people, which is very valuable. Once you ground yourself, then you understand all of these interactions much better. So that's one. And the other one is the very interesting, insightful comment that you made at the end, which is half of your nation is in the US and half of it in Mexico. And I come from Mexico City, where there was no transcontinental railroad and no boosters in this area. And so I guess my question is, so how does that narrative percolates in the southern part of your nation?
Well, I've dealt with Mexico quite a bit. I've gone down there. I've done presentations and also met with the Kumeyaay people down there. They have Tipaywa is an organization based in Ensenada, the Kumeyaay. They have some of it has been really difficult. Some of the archaeologists there are still using old archaeology from the 1930s and 1940s and describing the Kumeyaay. They say we're recent arrivals because human culture developed in the last 1,500 years, and but there's been so much stuff after that. It was not a one group that replaced another. There was overlap for hundreds of years. There's been genetic studies that have been done that show that were related to even the earliest people that were here. So they're still doing that. They found some remains down in Ensenada. They didn't want to allow the Kumeyaay in Baja to have any say in the disposition of the remains. I used to go to meetings, in my bio, you heard that I worked a lot in environmental. I was on the Good Neighbor Environmental Board, and I was on the Environmental Site Agreements Committee for EPA for NAFTA. Back in the 90s, and I used to go to meetings with our counterparts in Mexico. And there were several times where I brought up the Kumeyaay in Baja. And I said, well, what are you doing about the Indians in Baja? And the Mexican official said, there are no Indians in Baja. There are no Indians in Mexico. We're all Mexicans. And it wasn't until the Chiapas uprisings in the 90s that Mexico changed their constitution that said you have the right to continue to be who you are. Right. To continue your culture. But even then, it was just a paper. It gave you, there were no teeth to it. Right. And so just within the last couple of weeks, there's been a law that was introduced by a legislator from Baja, she's a Mixtec Indian, who's the elected representative for Baja. She introduced legislation that would give kind of like the Native American Graves and Repatriation Act in the US, that would give some rights to the indigenous people to the remains that are found in their territory. So so that was just recently something that passed. it's, you know, it's a question of identity when you talk about, you know, what is a Mexican? You know, what is a Mexican American? You know, what do you, you know, it depends on where you want to draw the line, where you want to say that, you know, I'm a Miskwish. Most of the Miskwish live in Mexico for my particular clan. Other clans mostly are up above, but we're exogamous, so we always married outside our clans. So everybody in the Kumeyaay territory has some descendancy from someone who was born in Mexico at one time or another, probably within, you know, 2 or 3 generations at the most. So yeah, it's so I don't know if I answered your question, but there has been some work on that. One of the things that there's been an effort by some people to have a UNESCO designation of the El Camino Real from California down into Baja. I keep saying, no, you know, it's a fiction you're creating there.
Yeah.
There's also been people in Baja who say, you know, who look at the missions that were recreated, how they're commercial successes. And some of them can't, they don't even advertise anymore because they don't have enough room for any more people to come through. They're just people just streaming through, spending money, and tribes don't benefit. Yeah, get a share of that, but these commercial operations that were created, we see that down in Baja, and so there's an effort in some of the areas to try to raise money to rebuild some of the missions down there. Once again, as part of that branding, you know, commercial effort.
So I don't know outside your wife if you're okay taking in 3 more questions because and I will cap that at those 3, okay? Because we need to be conscious of time. So there was Paulo wanted to make a question or comment, Marie, and then Roberto, okay?
I have a simple question later. Simple question.
Maybe we can do it afterwards. Okay, so Paulo.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for teaching me so much. I appreciate it. Very good. Being an astronomer, I look forward to read your cosmology part as well, right? My question goes back to linguistics and to your very first slide. You said that California is one of the richest concentrations of language as much as Papua New Guinea, right? Yeah. That's impressive. Yeah. Papua New Guinea, I can understand the mountains, there's isolation of different, but what's the reason behind that diversity in California? And what are you doing to protect it? Because it should be protected, right? If you please.
Yeah, we do have Indigenous California Languages organization that's trying to preserve a lot of languages that have been lost because the people have just been completely obliterated. There have been some tribes back east who actually, after a language has been lost, there's no fluent speakers, they've been able to resurrect them. And sometimes if their neighboring languages might have enough similarity that you can use it to fill in the words that are missing. We're lucky because half our tribe is in Mexico, and Mexico didn't start a real education program until like the 1960s, and they have these teachers that go out to remote areas to teach, and so they're teaching in Spanish. So until that time, kids were growing up speaking Kumeyaay. So we still have a population of it's only a handful now, but we still have fluent Kumeyaay speakers, and we bring them up here and as teachers, but don't tell the Homeland Security because they don't have work permits. So we pay them honorariums because they can't get a wage. Because if they get a wage, they'll get deported, and they won't.
Should be an official program supporting such teachers, right? Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Trying to get it more formal, but and then we have a lot of things too, like our songs. We have a lot more songs that were preserved up here north, so we take them down there. So we have a lot of cultural exchange that goes on.
Marie and then Roberto.
You know, saying that, you know, you don't want to have worse genocide, you know.
Want to compare genocide?
As a kid growing up in California, you know, I really was taught that Spanish did all the damage. There weren't any Indians left by 1850. But as I'm an economist, but I studied, you know, as you said, half the people in California in 1850 were Native American.
Yeah.
And really what happened between 1850 and 1910 is a whole other level. You know, Native American people here in San Diego, you know, the viciousness of the Spanish putting down the Kumeyaay Revolt in 1775 was really egregious. But later, under different leadership, the native people here also built what is left of the mission. I mean, for me, what's always struck me as the most interesting thing was an irrigation structure. It was a dam that I saw built by the Kumeyaay out behind the mission. And that part of you know, the Kumeyaay built this, and as you said, the Kumeyaay were outstanding agriculturalists. I remember reading that the city of San Diego, or maybe it was the city, I think it was the city, they built a waterway over Kumeyaay land, which extracted all the water from the land without the Kumeyaay getting it. I think it was out somewhere by Santa Isabel. And a tiny little drop of water would come out. And even from these little drops, people made cornfields. And that's just that, I feel like when we crash, we in California, we don't want to, you talked about in the old days, the Spanish system was romanticized, but in my lifetime, and I was born in 1963, I really never heard anything good about missions. And I had to, the fact that Native American people had built them and had built these waterways and had flourishing fields, I felt that I needed to know that. And I wonder.
Well, I think, yeah, you know, and you can wrangle with that, and trying to find the moral measure that you're gonna make on it. And there's so many ways to look at it. I mean, you could say the Spanish only had a tiny piece of the coast. So percentage wise, for their little enclaves, did they kill more people than the Americans who came in and spread out all over the Sierra Nevadas and the Oregon settlers that came in and started wiping out people? They were over a much wider area. So there would have been more people, even if they had an equal amount of nastiness to them, so it becomes a, it becomes a
bounty. They said kill Indian people, will pay you $25.
And the Spanish also had people who escaped the missions and who were drug in by, and they had soldiers that were sent out to go and drag them in, from their villages after they got away. So it's or kill them if they refuse to. So I mean, it's hard to go in and create a moral scale that you're going to go and apply to one group or another group. I just think it's just good to just lay the facts out on where it occurred, the extent of it, and what happened. And I personally, I mean, but if you want to, I mean, that's certainly okay if you want to do that. But I personally don't do that because I just see so many permutations of history and the things that happen culturally, I mean, you could look at how many cultures were exterminated in California and say, well, that's a lot worse than Hitler and the Jews, because that was only one culture. Yeah. And we had hundreds of them that got exterminated here, but I just don't even want to get into that way of thinking about things.
So last question, Roberto.
Rather just, as I was, first of all, thank you, this was very great and thorough. I learned a lot as well, and as I was hearing your talk, I was starting to think about, a question I had and my it was mentioned before, but I was wondering, so when did the Cabrillo monument go up? And I know there was a distinction made between knowing history and then the symbols and monuments, and I totally agree with that observation that history is more important, but nevertheless these symbols matter, right? And we do have these symbols. And as you were proceeding, one of the really striking points that I was like to know more about the Columbus situation was that the Columbus statues also came up in the late 1800s, the turn of the century, that had to do more with anti-Italian sentiment and people putting up these statues to feel themselves more American, or say the Spanish contributed here as well. So it made me wonder, and I guess more broader reflection for all of you that engaged us with Cabrillo, to what extent might it be the case that these Cabrillo monuments also are a part of that history, and less so about acknowledging, say, 1542 and more about the place of Portuguese in the 1800s. And if in doing so, that then allows for a broader, not so much disengagement, but properly contextualizing of why not be so committed to fighting to defend the Cabrillo monument if we're now in a different moment in history. I guess it's a broader question posed for everyone over the course of these next 2 days that you'll be engaged in.
So,
I
okay,
have
go
a
ahead,
very
one last
brief
question, we wrap up.
It's a linguistic question. I noticed on there on your language chart and the map that the Kumeyaay belong to the Shoshonian.
No.
Was it?
Human family.
Pardon me?
The human language family, so we go into the
But I
Kuchan.
mean, I got it mixed up, but there was one language group that was related to Shoshonian languages. Is that not so?
The Lusanians up in northern San Diego County are in the family.
Well, that's what I found interesting. Well, there it is.
Yeah.
They're the
The
Shoshonian.
Kuya, the Kupa, and the Lusanian, and then we're here and we're related to
Over
the
to the
humans
left.
and
Well, over to the
Mojave.
left, the tan map, it says Shoshonian.
yeah, that's
So
wrong.
are related to the Shoshones way up north?
Yeah, same family.
Same language group. How interesting.
Well,
So
because
far
that
away.
is
But I
part of
doubt
the
if they
Uto
understand
Aztec
each
and
other,
linguistic.
It's part of what?
Uto Aztec and linguistic group.
Well, it seems clear that history is yet to be written, and rewritten and rewritten and rewritten. I really want to thank you again, Michael, for all the speakers and to everyone that came here to watch and to learn. This is the university. That's what we do. There's a lot of dialogue to be made. So thank you very much. Okay.
Thanks for making the time.
Thank you.
It's a great day. It was an experience.
I love it when we're swinging. I'm sorry.
Then people start putting in their values.
Yeah.